All right.
All right. Good morning. Do we want to get started? It is 1 minute early. Let's wait 1 minute so that nobody is late. That is late.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a lot of stuff to go through. I think
But
it's
you're late if you're
You just sit next
at
to
the time the meeting starts.
yes.
But
Yeah.
we forgot to tell everybody that. That rule of thumb.
Okay. Well, it looks like we have it's 1 o'clock my time, so I'm thinking it's 10 o'clock your time. So I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. I know that this is like the 45th time we've talked about these buyer broker contracts. And, there seems to be quite a bit of confusion still going on. And so I think the more that we talk about it, the better off it's going to be. I have sort of a program and a plan that I'm going to go through this morning. I'm going to start off with the buyer or the broker's compensation advisory. That's the first form that we're going to go over because when we read through it and we understand it, it is going to give us the foundation truth of every single thing that we're going to be discussing with the rest of the documents. So on a show of hands, and even if you haven't done this, I'd like to know how many people have read the broker's compensation agreement or advisory in full. Okay. For those of you that have read it, do you still have questions about it? A little bit, yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of things to go over. But I truly believe that once we truly understand what that advisory has in it, it will make all of the rest of the documents that we're going to be talking about today make sense. The second group of documents that I'm going to talk about is the buyer non-agency agreement and also the open house visitors non-agency agreement. I think so many of us have focused on the fact that we've never had a buyer sign a buyer broker agreement before, or very rarely have we done that we've skipped over the fact that a lot of times we interact with prospective purchasers who are buyers, but we don't represent them. And so we need to be familiar with the documents that will protect us by saying, hey, look, I'm representing the seller. I don't represent you. Okay. And so we're going to talk about those two documents next. Then we will go into the buyer broker agreement and its little sister document that is the property showing and representation agreement. I think we're probably going to spend a little bit more time on that one first, because I think that's the one most people are going to use in the beginning. And then we'll talk about the seller to pay the buyer broker, which is usually attached to the purchase agreement. Okay, makes sense for everybody? All right, so I'm going to share my screen and we will get into this first document, which is the broker compensation. Oops, let's see, share it. There we go. There we go. Let's see here. I hate when this happens. Okay. So we have the broker compensation advisory, just so that everyone knows, we have made this a mandatory document for every file in SkySlope, whether you're representing a buyer in a purchase, if you're not representing a buyer in a purchase and you're representing a seller in a purchase. I believe as the broker, the most important thing that we can do is educate our customers with exactly what the true changes are that are taking place, not what they've heard on CNN, not what they've heard from their friends or their brother-in-law, or what they've heard from some pundit that's on social media somewhere. And this document, when we truly understand it, will explain everything, I believe, in really good language. Okay. So I'm going to go over the basics through it, each paragraph. And it starts off with sellers. When sellers list their property for sale through a real estate broker, they agree to pay the seller's broker when escrow closes. Pretty straightforward information there. It says listing agreement compensation is fully negotiable. That's an important point that the Department of Justice and NAR wants to get across. When a seller enters into a listing agreement with a broker, the seller authorizes the broker to find a buyer for the seller's property and agrees to pay the seller's broker if a buyer is found who purchases the property. Compensation amounts are not fixed by law and are fully negotiable between the seller and the seller's broker. When negotiating compensation, the parties may discuss factors such as the broker's expertise and experience, the type of broker services to be performed, and the broker's time and expenses, among other considerations. Because I can't see everybody, since I'm sharing my screen, are there any questions on that before I make one comment about it? Okay. So I think that last line is something that is really, really important because a lot of people are afraid that this change in the way that we're doing business is somehow going to negatively affect the amount of income that we get and the size of the commissions that we earn. And that's not necessarily true. And the key to that is when negotiating compensation, the parties will discuss factors such as the broker's expertise and experience, the services you're going to perform, the broker's time and expenses, among other things. So if your value proposition is that you will write the contract and then be missing an action for the rest of the transaction, your compensation is probably not going to be all that high. But if you have a long list of services and benefits that you provide to your client, you're going to be able to negotiate higher fees. So I think it's important that you recognize that. Paragraph B, optional additional compensation if buyer is unrepresented. I believe that this is going to happen a lot. I believe this is going to happen a lot. I believe a lot of buyers are doing their own research. They're driving around looking at open houses. They're searching online. They're reaching out to agents. And, all of the leads that you get from online services or people that you've never talked to, they're basically unrepresented when you first talk with them. And so with the new change that's going on in place, some of those people that come to you as leads that are buyer leads may choose not to be represented and may ask you to buy the property that you show them and not have you represent them because they don't want to compensate you. So this is very important. Additional compensation is available. A listing agreement may include optional additional compensation amounts owed to the seller's broker for situations where the broker takes on additional responsibilities or workload. Sometimes a buyer may not be working nor want to be represented by a real estate broker, which is what I just said. When that happens, the seller's broker is not required to represent the buyer, and the seller and seller's broker may decide that they do not want to create such a relationship. Can you imagine the benefit to your seller if you have a fiduciary responsibility to your seller only and you don't have that same obligation to the buyer? You still have to be fair and honest to the buyer, but you don't have a fiduciary duty to them. That could be in the seller's benefit, and it's also a better way for us to stay out of trouble from a legal standpoint. In those situations, the seller's broker is advised to use a buyer's non-agency CAR form BNA to inform the buyer that the seller's broker will be acting on behalf of the seller only and not act as the buyer's agent throughout the transaction. However, because the buyer is unrepresented, the seller's agent will inevitably have to do more work to facilitate the transaction. A seller may agree to compensate their broker for the additional work in such cases. And I'm thinking that as a real estate agent and broker, I would want the seller to compensate me more if I'm doing more work. I mean, I'm sure that all of you agree. So any questions on that? Okay. C, broker may represent both buyer and seller and have dual agency. California law is a brokerage company to represent both seller and buyer in a real estate transaction. At the time the agent on behalf of a brokerage obtains a signature of a seller on a listing agreement, the agents will not, in most cases, know who the eventual buyer will be for the seller's property. Similarly, at the time an agent on behalf of a brokerage obtains the signature of a buyer on a buyer's representation agreement, the agent will not, in most cases, know who the eventual seller will be for a property the buyer wants to buy. Because many individual licensees may work through the one brokerage company and some individual licensees work with many buyers and sellers, there is a possibility that the same brokerage company will represent both the buyer and the seller in the transaction. If licensees working through the broker represent both seller and buyer, Broker is allowed to receive compensation from each, provided the seller and buyer are advised of the relationship and the total amount of compensation the broker will receive. So I think this is a really important thing to understand. And I'm going to go back a little bit into basic agency laws. You know, when you are somebody's agent, you have a fiduciary duty to them. If you don't represent a party in a transaction, you have the duty to be fair and honest with them. Okay. Most people don't realize, you know, they'll think that, you know, that Mike, you know, is a Remax agent and Annette is a Remax agent and Mark is a Remax agent and that we're all three individuals. But in truth, every contract that is written through Remax Big Bear or Remax Area Experts, the broker is me. You all have the same broker. And so when you are selling an in-house listing, whether you represent the seller directly as the listing agent, it is still dual agency 100% of the time. Does that make sense? Two different agents in the same company, it's really the same agent. You guys have a dual agency representation agreement. So what this whole thing is saying is that whether it's you know, let's say it's Mike Walkner has a listing and he has a buyer that wants to buy it. The seller assigned a listing and Mike is his agent and I'm the broker for that. And then Mike gets a buyer broker agreement that is signed with a buyer and his buyer decides to buy Mike's listing. It's pretty clear in that case that Mike is a dual agency personally, and he's a dual agency situation because of the company. But if Gina writes an offer on it, it's the same thing. It's a dual agency. And this allows two contracts to be taking place where the seller is paying Remax Big Bear Mark and the buyer is paying Remax Big Bear Mark, but it's going to Gina as the sub-agent, you know, the agent in the transaction, and for Mike for the seller. I know that that's a pretty complicated issue. I mean, it's pretty clear to me after 40 years of being in the business. Is there any questions about that?
Mark, it's Becky. I have a question on the last one. I'm driving for Meals on Wheels and couldn't unmute quick enough.
Okay.
Okay, say I get a buyer calls me, wants to look at my listing and they don't want to be represented and they want to write an offer. And I send my son Joseph, who freshly got his license, who's going to be my buyer's agent, to go show them. How does that whole thing work? People with buyer's agents.
Well, the first thing that would have to happen is that your son would have to have them sign a buyer non-agency agreement. And we're going to go into that document next. So I'll be able to answer some more of that question in more detail when we go over that document. But there is absolutely nothing that said, I mean, you know, by virtue of, you know, again, going back to the principle of agency that we just talked about, is every single listing at Remax Big Bear and Area Experts is tied to my license. And Becky is a sub-agent of my license, and your son is a sub-agent of my license, and Gina and Mike and Annette and Mary and Evan, everyone in the company, even Dan and Simeon are sub-agents of my license, okay? So the correct way to fill out the buyer non-agency agreement would basically be saying that your son is representing the seller only in that showing, and then we'll go through the rest of that and that they're not representing the buyer, okay?
Thank you.
I have a question too, Mark. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so on the back to the dual agency thing and that portion where it says, you know, seller will offer to pay an additional amount of money if you're assisting both sides. So does that come into play only if the buyer has asked you to be their representation, or does that also come into play if a buyer has said they're going to self-represent, but you're still helping facilitate? I didn't understand quite the difference between the two.
Okay. Well, if a, yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of, you know, gray area in my thinking here. If you are whether you do work on behalf of a buyer, and so what I'm going to say is that just because I write a purchase agreement for a buyer that says they reject my agency, They sign a buyer non-agency thing. It doesn't mean that I can't write a purchase contract for them.
Okay,
I can't follow, I can follow their instructions and write the purchase contract. I can have that buyer say, I'm unrepresented, I'm not paying you, you represent the seller, you write the contract. We'll sign what we're willing to agree to sign. We're going to represent ourselves. Oh, by the way, I have an appraiser coming up. I live in Huntington Beach. Would you open it up and make the house available for our appraiser? Oh, by the way, would you do these other things? The fact that you are doing administrative tasks for that buyer does not create an agency relationship.
okay, so when that other side of the additional commission comes into play is when you do have an agency agreement with the buyer's side as well.
Nope, nope. The
Oh.
additional compensation is paid for by the seller whenever the buyer is unrepresented. So you could have you could technically, I mean, here's a possibility. You could have an attorney that says, I'm an attorney and I'm really cool. I mean, we've all met attorneys like that, and I'm going to write my own contract. And they present us with a purchase agreement and they're unrepresented. And so you're going to send them the buyer non-agency disclosure that says, hey, I represent the seller only. You're unrepresented. You're representing yourself. And I don't have a agency relationship with you. And that attorney may do all of his own work and he's unrepresented by a real estate broker. He's just representing himself as an attorney. Okay. And if he does that, the clause would allow you to receive compensation from the seller in addition to the 2.5 or 3% that you're getting for representing him. That makes sense.
That is exactly what I was wondering. It was a little bit, I got confused on that, but that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know how many attorneys or people are going to write their own I don't know how many people are going to do that. Attorneys certainly will, but regular people probably won't. But you will also get the additional compensation if you write a purchase agreement for a buyer that rejects your agency. If you get a buyer that says, Melissa, I want you to write up the deal, but I don't want you to be my agent. You can represent the seller. I don't care. I don't want to pay you. But if you'll prepare the contracts and put the deal together, you're benefiting your seller. And I would say, I would agree with that. I would agree that I'm benefiting my seller by assisting this buyer to buy it, even though they're not paying me. And even if they're not paying me, I want to make sure that I'm getting paid for doing the work, and the listing agreement allows that to happen. Okay. And we will talk about, that's the last contract that we're going to talk about today, is a listing agreement. Okay.
So real quick, just that second section in the listing agreement that talks about the additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented, that applies to both buyers unrepresented and dual agency?
No, it's not dual agency. No.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me, I'm going to go back. I'll try and say it in a different way. When you are an agent, you have a fiduciary duty with the client, and the client assumes, the client willingly signs. They sign an agency agreement and they sign a document that says, I want you to be my agent. I'm hiring you to be my agent. Just because you write a purchase agreement on behalf of a purchaser, you can be what's called a transactional broker, meaning that you're not their agent. You're just filling out the paperwork. That's not dual agency. That's probably the most new thing that is happening in all of this as we're going through it. I think there's 15, 20 other states that have no dual agency, and they have transactional brokers, where you can work as a transactional agent, where you don't have, it's basically would be like a paralegal. Paralegals can't practice law, but they write legal documents. An attorney is a fiduciary for his client. A paralegal is an administrative person that is not practicing law, but is working in legal documents. And that's what a transactional agent would be, is somebody that's not acting in their licensed capacity as an agent. They are doing administrative work.
And in that case, if we were to write the offer for a buyer, we would be, the seller's agent, but we would leave the whole buyer agent stuff blank.
Or write in unrepresented, or, you could
That's
write.
probably better.
Yeah, unrepresented, agency
Okay.
rejected. I don't know what the
I think you're right. Putting unrepresented might make it more clear,
Yeah,
clear as mud.
but if you, okay,
Mark-
so I have a question here from Mary Wilson. It says, but if you show property, you have to have the buyer sign that you are their agent, BRBC. Aren't we their agent? The answer is no. If you are showing your listing or you're showing a Remax listing, you can have them sign a buyer non-agency agreement. And that agreement, which is the one that we're going to get to next, says that I represent the seller only. I don't represent you. So it's not true that because you show a property, you have to have a buyer broker agreement, that you have to have a contract with the buyer. The buyer may reject that, and that would mean that I couldn't show Compass listings, I couldn't show Coldwell Banker listings, I couldn't show Keller Williams listings, and I might not show them any listings other than mine with, without an agency agreement. I might tell them call the listing agent. So it's really clear. I want it to be really clear is that you can show your own listing to a buyer with them rejecting your agency or not signing a buyer broker agreement, but you do have to have them sign either the buyer non-agency or the open house visitor non-agency, which are the next forms that we're going to get to.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I might be interjecting. You might be covering this. I have one more clarification question on dual agency, Mark.
Okay.
Okay, so if you have actual dual agency happening, in that case, then are you going to proceed on your offer with a commission request that's like a standard one, like you would be receiving if you had an agent that was coming with a buyer's commission request in the offer, and it doesn't automatically fall back on that additional percentage that's in the listing agreement?
Okay. So, we're not looking at the buyer non-agency and we're not looking at the buyer broker agreement right now. So some of the things that I'm referencing are in those documents,
Okay,
but
I can wait. I just was
Yeah.
curious about that aspect.
yeah, let me answer it. Let me answer it now. Okay. Is that the Department of Justice wants to separate the compensation between the listing broker and the buyer's broker. They don't want the two brokers getting together and deciding what people are paying. Okay. So if you are it's possible that you could be a buyer's broker agent. You could be an agent for a buyer and do it for no fee. I don't know why you would want to do that, but it's possible that you could do that. And one of the scenarios that I think is really interesting is if I, and I'm going to use this as an example, is if I have my listing agreement says that the seller is going to pay me 3%, if the property sells, and they're going to give me additional compensation of 2%, they're going to give me additional compensation of 2%. If a buyer buys the property that's unrepresented. So that's what my listing agreement says. 3% to me for representing the seller. And if the buyer is unrepresented, I get 2 extra because the seller knows I'm going to be doing extra work. So that's my listing agreement. And then a buyer calls me and says, hey, Mark, I want to see your listing. Oh, now that I've seen it, I want to buy it. And you say, do you have an agent? And they say, no. I don't have an agent. And you say, well, do you want me to represent you? And they say, well, what's your fee? Well, my fee is 2.5% or 3%, whatever you decide that you want it to be. Remember, it's negotiable. And the buyer says, well, my brother-in-law will do it for 1%. My brother-in-law will do it for 1%. Now, if his brother-in-law buys it, then your compensation is now 3%. Right? In your listing agreement, does everybody get that?
Right, but if he says he wants to use you, are you asking for 2% because of what's in the listing agreement, or are you going to ask for 2.5 or 3% because
I can ask for anything I want. I mean, it's negotiable. It's negotiable. But in this situation, the example that I'm giving you is that if I were to say to this buyer, as my normal buyer fee is 3%, and he says, well, my brother-in-law will do it for 1%. I might come back and say, just for you, you know, I will represent the seller only and write the deal as a transactional broker and help you put the deal together, and you won't have to pay me anything. You won't have to get your brother-in-law in to mess up the deal, you know, to work out of his expertise, to work out of his area, to not properly service you. You know, I'll do it as an accommodation to you as a transactional broker. And then the buyer signs a buyer non-agency disclosure with me where I'm representing the seller only. Now I'm getting 5%. I'm getting the 3% for representing the seller, and I'm getting the extra 2% for helping the unrepresented buyer buy the property.
Mark,
Yes.
maybe this will help clear it up as well. As soon as that buyer says they want you to represent them, then you get them to sign the buyer broker agreement that has your commission in it. And when you write the offer, you check the box that you're asking seller to pay the commission and submit that seller commission document with it
Yeah. Yeah.
when you're dual agent.
Yeah. So we will get to that when we get to the seller to pay the buyer broker stuff.
Awesome.
Okay?
Thank you,
I have
guys.
a
Thanks,
quick
Maureen. Yeah,
question.
I didn't know as soon as you hit dual agency, if it defaulted to that second number, but that makes sense.
Yeah. So, and the one thing I really want to make sure and make clear is that everybody knows just because you are writing a contract for somebody doesn't mean you're their agent. They can reject your agency agreement and you can still be a transactional broker for them.
I have a
Okay.
question.
That's new to me for sure.
So who's the next question?
I have a question. Now, if you say you have an unrepresented buyer and you're going to be as a transactional agent for them, do you have to disclose to the buyer that that you're getting what your commission's going to be? Because,
No.
you know, at the end of the day, they'll probably, you know, their offer is going to have to be a little bit higher because the seller at the end of the day is looking at their net sheet. So do we have to disclose to the buyer that as their transactional agent, not a fiduciary, but an agent, I'm going to be making another point, 1%.
I don't believe so. Yeah.
You
I
don't believe so?
I
Okay.
don't believe so. Not at this point. I
Okay.
don't know. I don't know that that the only compensation that I know that is required to be disclosed is if a buyer's agent presents an offer where they're asking the seller to pay the representation amount, then they have to disclose to the seller what that amount is, and they have to provide, if they're requested to show the buyer broker agreement. But there's no rule anywhere or law anywhere that says that a listing agreement has to be disclosed to the buyer, because the buyer's not involved with it. Okay. So I think we're going into a lot of pretty technical stuff. Let's go back into the broker agreements with the buyers, because some of the principles are exactly the same. Buyer's representation compensation is fully negotiable. I mean, that is a point that they want to, make over and over and over. That's one of the most important reasons for the Department of Justice getting involved with this, is making it negotiable, making it transparent, decoupling it away so that the brokers aren't conspiring as to what their fee is going to be. And it's basically exactly the same language with the seller. It says, when negotiating compensation, the parties may discuss factors such as the broker's expertise and experience, the type of broker services to be performed, and the broker's time and expenses, among other considerations. And I think this is probably where, where there's going to be the biggest movement, in buyer broker compensation is, do the buyers find value in the services that we're providing? If we don't understand the contract, if we don't know the inventory, if we're not available, if we don't return calls, if we don't fill out our contracts properly, I mean, if we don't do a high level job, then the buyers are going to look at us and say, I can hire somebody to do it for cheaper, or I can get an attorney to do it for me cheaper. Okay. So it's going to be really important to make sure that we have a great value proposition when we are negotiating our fees with buyers. Item B, requirement for written agreements. This is a huge change. We've represented buyers for at least the last 40 years that I'm aware of without having a written agreement most of the time. And it goes into exactly why. It says pursuant to a nationwide class action settlement reached by the National Association of Realtors, participants, this is important, participants in multiple listing services are required to have a written agreement with a buyer prior to showing a buyer a residential property, giving a buyer a tour of such property. The agreement must identify the amount of compensation to be paid to the broker for services provided and require that the broker cannot receive any compensation in excess of the amount specified in the agreement. Pursuant to legislation expected to become law in California on January 1st, 2025, all licensees showing a buyer any type of property will be required to have a written agreement with the buyer prior to showing. So this reminds me of Mary Wilson's question, because this sounds like you can not show a property to somebody unless they hire you as their agent. Well, the example that I was using is that if you represent the seller and you show a buyer that's unrepresented and have them sign a non-agency disclosure, you're still representing the seller. And so you're providing service to your client, which is the seller. I'm excited about getting to that form because I think it'll really sort of bring up some good information for you. Advantages of written contracts. Gosh, there's so many. Buyers and their brokers benefit when the terms of their relationship and respective duties are in writing. A written agreement establishes a clear mutual expectations and helps avoid misunderstandings over the buyer and the broker's duties and the amount of compensation the buyer's agent is to be paid. The biggest advantage of the written agreements is there's going to be a hell of a lot less arguments over procuring costs. There's going to be a hell of a lot less in that, that's the biggest advantage. And they didn't even write that in here. Okay. Item 3, this is pretty important. When enlisting a real estate broker to represent them, buyers agree to pay the buyer's broker when escrow closes, but the person responsible for payment may be negotiated in the transaction. The short version of that is that the buyer is contractually obligated to pay it, but you can negotiate with the seller to pay that obligation in the form of a concession. You could theoretically, I think, although this is going to get challenged if it happens, is the listing broker could share a portion of their compensation with you in order to induce you to do that. But, we'll stay away from that right now. The buyer pays the compensation pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. A buyer's broker may negotiate the amount of compensation directly with the buyer and then document that agreement in a buyer representation agreement, CAR form, BRBC, or PSRA. And we're going to talk about those soon. The buyer then becomes contractually obligated to pay the broker by providing funds to escrow to the closing of a transaction. Okay. Item B, seller pays the compensation. This is what I think is going to happen most. Buyer negotiates the seller to compensate buyer's broker. A buyer may make a conditional offer to the seller by including a term in the purchase offer asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker if the buyer has already agreed to pay their own broker pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. If such a term is included in the purchase offer, the request will become one term among many that a seller may accept, reject, or negotiate by way of a counteroffer. The possibility of asking the seller to pay the buyer's contractual compensation obligation should be discussed when creating a buyer representation agreement and prior to an offer being made. Okay. So the one thing that is allowed in this that I don't like, okay, is that the seller may accept, you asked for 3%, I accept that. You've asked for 3%, I reject that. Or negotiate. I don't like this, and I hope they get away from it, okay? And I'll give you an example of what I mean. If I write an offer on behalf of my buyer on a $100,000 house, and the listing broker is getting 2.5% or 3%, whatever they're getting, I don't even know what they're getting because I'm not a party to that contract, and I have a buyer broker agreement with my buyer where they've agreed to pay me 3%, and we write a full price offer of $100,000, on the house, and the seller says, I'll accept the $100,000, but I'm only going to pay you 1%. My belief is that this allows that to happen, but I think there's a problem with it in that the seller is now interfering with my buyer broker agreement. It's forcing my my buyer to pay money out of their pocket that they may or may not have. And so I think it would be the same as me making an offer to, I could counter, let's say that the seller counters $100,000 is fine, but I'll only pay you 1%. And so my buyer makes a counter offer that says, we'll pay you 100%, you pay my broker 3%, and you pay your agent 1%. I mean, we don't want sellers and buyers and agents trying to negotiate the other agent's fees. So I'm going to really encourage all of you to try and stay away from reducing the buyer broker fee in your counter offers, because I think it's going to create a lot more problems for us than it does help us to put deals together. I was expecting hands raised and questions on that one.
So instead of messing with their commission, focus more on the purchase price, increase the purchase price instead of the commission adjustment.
Yeah. One of the negotiating phrases that I use when I'm, talking with a seller or a buyer for that matter is when you get an offer that asks for 10 or 15 things. And I mean, it's, some of it seems petty and there's a little bit of this and this. I don't want to pay for the home protection plan. Well, I don't want to give them a credit for $2,000 for the term. And I don't want to do this. I don't want to pay 3% of their closing costs and everything. I will always say to the seller, we need a win-win transaction, for everybody we want to have a successful transaction. We want you to be happy and we want the buyer to be happy because they're trying to buy your property, right? So let's give them everything that we can give them as long as we get what we want. Let's give them everything we can possibly give them as long as we get what we want. And if the credits and everything that they're asking for is $4,000 higher than the net that we're after, let's counter the property $4,000 or the transaction $4,000 higher. If we get the $4,000 higher, we're happy because we get the net we want, and the buyer is happy because they got all the other terms that they wanted. Okay. The worst counteroffer in the world is when you have a counteroffer that comes back and says, we're not going to do this, and we're only going to do half of that, and we're not going to do this, we won't do that. Oh, and we're going to raise the price a little bit too. I mean, those are really tough counteroffers for a buyer to get. I love going back to a buyer and saying, hey, they gave you, they agreed to everything on our offer except the price, and they've countered at $104,000. Okay, and then there's only one thing left to agree on in order to move forward, if that makes sense.
I have a thought, and I
Okay.
know I already expressed my opinion on this, but I believe that now that compensation is now in the contract, if we are not agreeing to what's being requested in the contract and it's a compensation term, we have to use the counter offer to counter that. And then it's up to the buyer and the buyer agent to discuss how they want to do what they want to do on their end and renegotiate their own terms with each other. But because it's in the actual contract, I believe you have to, if you're not agreeing to it, you have to counter it in a counter offer. How else do you not agree to it if you don't counter it?
So give me an example, a real life example of an offer and a buyer's compensation that you don't want to pay.
Well, what I'm saying is, if it's asked for in the offer,
Right.
if you don't agree with it, what mechanism do you have to say you don't agree with it unless you counter it?
Well, okay, so I'm going to say this. So I'm a seller, or I'm a listing agent, and you're my seller, and we get an offer for 100,000, and the buyer's agent broker fee is 3%, and you were only planning on paying 2%. And so you say, well, I'll take the 100,000. That's great, but I'm only going to pay him 2%. And I'm going to say to you, well, you know, the buyer on the other side has a contract with their buyer, and the buyer broker agreement that they've sent us has the box checks that says the buyer doesn't have the additional cash to pay it. So if we counter at 101,000, Maureen, you'll get the same net that you're after, and we won't be interfering with their contract, and we won't lose them.
I mean, I agree, that's the better way to do it, but I don't know that most sellers and their agents will be savvy that way.
Well, you're going to be that savvy, and I'm going to be that savvy, and all of us Remax people are going to be that savvy. You know, and I
Okay.
think, I think it comes down to, you know, I want to share with everybody to have an open mind, rather than think about what was, think about what is. And what was that commissions were negotiable, and for years it used to be 7%, and the listing broker would keep 4 and give away 3. Then it went to 6%, and it was 3 and 3, and then it was 5%, or it was 6% and 5% if I sell it myself. And, you know, then it was 5%, split 2.5, 2.5. I mean, we've had these, we've had these patterns of behavior that we've gone into. And the thing that was the same all of that time was that the listing broker and the seller determined what the buyer broker fee was going to be. That's gone. That's over.
So as the seller, what we're going to try to do, because we are the savvy people, is rather than counter the commission, just fudge all the other numbers around to make it work. And basically accept the commission, but maybe raise the price or do the, you know, whatever the case may be.
That's, you know, that's, and there is a, you know, there is a phrase, you know, there's a phrase for it. I mean, and, you know, we have to find language that is really good with our clients, because I mean, everybody's trying to figure it out. I mean, I'm trying to find how to say it in less time is really the key. How do you get the message across in less time? Okay. But, you know, there is a legal term called tortious interference. Tortious interference. Okay. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you had a listing agreement with your seller at 4%, and you offered 2% to the listing agent, and you were keeping 2%, you were fair. You were just discounting the commission that you and the seller had negotiated. And some buyer came and said, you know, well, I don't work for 2%. So they would write a purchase agreement, and they would write in the offer, seller to pay the buyer's agent 3% because that's what I'm worth. The legal principle there is that you're not a party to the listing agreement. And when the buyer made that term in the offer, it's called tortious interference. It's interfering with somebody else's contract. That word, tortious interference, I mean, it was no good when the sellers and the listing brokers were negotiating the buyer's fees to change it. And that same principle should come into play here. The best way for our industry to find out what our real value is to stop countering buyer broker commissions lower and raise the sales price, or negotiate it in a way that the buyers are getting paid what they've agreed to do. Okay, that's the best way to do it. I don't know how it's going to work. I think that there's going to be plenty of people that do exactly the opposite of what I'm suggesting, and they're going to say, well, we'll only pay you 2.5%. It's like, well, I mean, why do you care what the buyer is willing to pay their agent? Why do you care? If you're the listing broker, why do you care?
Mark.
Yes.
So one of the conversations that I've had with Allie was, what if a seller is worried about value when it comes to the appraisal?
Okay. And we've had that issue before when the commissions were handled differently, right?
Well, yeah, I completely agree. But what if they're like, hey, you're trying to get me to push the price, but we're already worried about having an appraisal issue and, you know, pushback on value based on, you know, whatever market value is.
Okay.
Yeah, because Mark, in the meeting, you had said that, you know, oh yeah, just kind of build it into the price, and then say we get an escrow, and then there's an appraisal problem, and then now there's a commission problem too.
Both of you been in the business for a lot of years. Have you ever had an appraisal come in low?
Yeah, but I'm just, you had proposed to say to the seller, you know, we'll just raise the price and then that can help, you know, cover the commission. But then all of a sudden we get an appraisal problem and they're like, well, you told me to do that. And now we have an appraisal problem. So I don't know. I know that they can figure it out, but
Mhm.
if you're presenting it that way and then there's an appraisal issue,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well,
Seems
here's
problematic to me.
here's one of the biggest challenges that this change is going to create is it's going to create a lot of ambiguity in appraisals, because how are appraisers going to know whether there was commission paid outside of the deal or whether it was in the purchase price? If this, and I'm stating if the standard practice follows what I'm suggesting to do, is that the comps are going to be higher, the appraisals are going to come in higher because the buyer broker fees are going to be baked into the price, just like they've been for the last 40 years. And, you know, and I think my script to a seller that expressed that concern is, you know, that's a valid concern. I've been in the business for 38 years, and I can't tell you how many transactions that I have run into a problem with the appraisal. And I can't tell you how we'll resolve it, but I can tell you I resolved 90% of those problems and still have a closed transaction. But we don't have that problem today. You know, right now we have the problem of getting the buyer to buy our house. So let's try and solve that one. And if the appraisal becomes a problem, let me try and solve that one.
That's good.
Okay. So we are, I think we were here. Buyer negotiates the seller to compensate the buyer's broker. I might be reading it again. I've already done that. Okay. So, you know, we can write in, and when you see the buyer broker agreement, you're going to see a thing that says we don't have the money to pay, and then the seller to pay the buyer broker compensation. That's the document we're going to add to the purchase agreement. This thing, buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly with the seller. This is basically if you're selling a FSBO or an expired that's no longer listed. If a seller is unrepresented or does not have an exclusively agency relationship with another broker, a buyer's broker may approach that seller asking the seller to sign an agreement, CAR Form SP, Single Party Compensation Agreement. Some of us have used that document many times in the past when selling an unlisted property, and ask them to pay the buyer's broker. So that's a pretty easy situation. In this situation, the seller agrees to pay the buyer's broker compensation without necessarily creating an agency relationship with the broker. So you don't have to be a dual agency. You can be a total buyer's agent representing the buyer only, have a buyer broker compensation agreement, and then write an offer to a seller and ask them to pay it with a single party compensation. And you don't even have to be the seller's agent to do it. Okay. However, because the seller is unrepresented, the buyer's agent will inevitably have to do more work to facilitate the transaction, which may be factored into the negotiation of the single party compensation agreement. You know, and so this brings up an issue that I want to share with you, and I think it's going to happen less on a single party compensation agreement than it does on our regular listing agreements with our sellers. Our typical sellers, where we have been taking on average, I mean, the average has been 2.5% for quite a while. Some people go down to 2%, you know, on their, you know, part for a listing. I think it needs to go back to 3%, and it may even need to go higher. And the reason that I'm suggesting that you start pushing back and fighting for higher commissions on the listing side is you're going to end up doing a lot more unpaid for work on behalf of unrepresented buyers. There's going to be more showings. There's going to be more customer service for them. So don't shortchange yourself. If you're already doing 2.5% and you're doing more work on behalf of the buyers, pretty soon it's going to start hurting you financially, and you're going to have to cut the quality of the service that you provide to your clients. Okay. So the last paragraph here, really good. This is sort of sums it all up. Historically, in California, many sellers used a multiple listing service to make a unilateral offer to compensate a buyer's broker who procured a buyer for the seller's property. However, the nationwide settlement prohibits the seller's broker from using an MLS to make such an offer of compensation. The California Association of Realtors listing agreement forms no longer provide for such offers of cooperating broker compensation nor does CAR include other forms in its library of forms that might facilitate such offers. Buyers and sellers must separately negotiate compensation with their respective brokers as specified above. So the big change, and this is the open mind, is throw out everything we've done for the last 40 years. The seller and the listing broker are not to be involved with negotiating a buyer broker fee. They can negotiate a deal and they can add terms to a deal of what they will or won't accept, but it's not up to them to decide what a buyer broker's fee is going to be. Okay, and they shouldn't be trying to negotiate that. They should be negotiating their deal. So, the last way that I'll say that is that, if I were to use that example of $100,000 purchase and I asked for 3% and the seller said, I'm not willing to pay you 3%, I'll pay you 2%. I'd go back to my buyer and just say, do you want to write me a check for $1,000 at close of escrow, or do you want to raise the price to $101,000 and have the seller pay your entire fee? And most likely the buyer would say, well, raise the price to, so I'd counter it at 101, with a full fee in it. Okay. So any questions on that document? Because we need to get moving on. Okay. I see some questions in the chat. Let me go to that before. Another question will be, yeah, that's true. Yeah. Tanya's another issue will be all cash buyers. Just because they're all cash, the seller might decide that the buyer might be able to convert the buyer agent commission and insist so. Does the buyer offer less? And we explained it in the email and we send the RPA. Well, it depends, Tanya, if, the appraisal thing is an issue and the comps are an issue. So if cash offers don't have the seller paying the fee, that means that they're artificially going to be lowered. The appraisal comps are going to be artificially lowered by the amount of the buyer broker compensation. I don't know what the consequences of that are going to be long term, but I don't think it's helpful. Okay, so I think that's it. Okay, so we're going to go into the buyer non-agency agreement. Okay. Everybody's been focused on how do I get a buyer to sign a buyer broker agreement? Well, equally important is to protect us so that we don't have any unintended agency or miscommunication with a buyer that we're showing property to. Okay. We're not doing a lease. Seller landlord is the owner of real property, so that would be whatever the seller of my property is. I put in the address, the parcel number, Big Bear Lake, San Bernardino. Here's the buyer's name, Mary Jo Buyer. Mark Dolan at Remax Big Bear is a California real estate licensee, has entered into a written agreement with the seller for the marketing and sale of the property. So I have an agency relationship with the seller is what that's saying. If checked, and this could be Mary Sue, the buyer's sister, the other broker is a real estate licensee other than the seller landlord's broker who represents buyer. So if the buyer has their own agent, you do this form saying, I'm showing you the property and I represent the seller and your agent's not here, but you're represented by your agent. So you would check that box if they've already got an agent. No representation of buyer by the seller's broker. Seller and landlord's broker does not represent the buyer tenant, and seller landlord broker will not be the buyer's tenant agent during any negotiation or transaction that results between the buyer tenant and the seller regarding the property. It means I'm not their agent. I'm not involved in the negotiating. All I'm doing is I am going to show them the property. All acts of the seller, even those that assist the buyer in entering into a transaction or performing or completing any of the buyer's contractual or legal obligations, hiring a home inspection, making access for the home inspection, getting the permits from the city, whatever you do on behalf of the buyer does not make you their agent. They're for the benefit of the seller exclusively because the seller is my fiduciary client. Any information that the buyer tenant reveals to the seller's broker may be conveyed to the seller landlord. That's the beautiful thing about representing the seller only. Anything the buyer says to you you can use against them in negotiating on behalf of your seller. And that's what that is telling you right there, is that anything the buyer says to you, you're going to be passing it along to your seller for their benefit. Okay. Let's assume that this box is not checked and the buyer does not have another broker. At the time you have them sign this, the representation of the buyer by others. Buyer tenant is represented by other broker. Any questions that buyer tenant may have regarding the scope of that representation should be directed to the other broker. So remember that sister-in-law that we talked about. If they have a buyer broker with somebody else, this box should be checked and the person should be identified there. This box down here says that the buyer at the time that we're signing this document does not have an agent. They don't have any, they are not represented by any other broker at this time. Buyer tenant has the right to enter into an agency relationship with a real estate licensee other than the seller's brokers. That means they can go find somebody else, or at any time during the negotiation or transaction regarding the property. So let's say that I write an offer on behalf of this person because she's unrepresented, and halfway through the transaction, they send me a note that says, we're represented by my brother-in-law. Guess what? They have the right to do that. Buyer has the right to enter into an agency relationship with a real estate licensee other than the seller's broker at any time during any negotiation or transaction regarding the property. That's important to know. You can negotiate the deal all the way down and just about ready for acceptance, and they could say, my brother-in-law is in the deal, we want him to get paid, or I'm going to pay him. Okay. So be aware of that.
So,
But that's only if you check that box, it applies, correct? What if you don't check that box, then it doesn't apply?
Well, either one of these is going to be applied. Either one of these is going to be checked. Either they're represented or they're not.
so if an agent swoops in at the last second, then that would negate that additional, obviously that would negate the additional commission that you would have kind of been getting from that non-agency thing.
That's correct.
Although you could probably negotiate it, considering you've done all the work, that you would pay, because they still have to come up with the BRBC and the SPBB if they want. That's just going under the assumption that the buyer's not going to pay for their, brother-in-law or baby mama, whatever, that jumps in at the last minute.
I mean, that's probably a worst case, egregious kind of behavior, is that you get to the very end of the deal and all of a sudden, I mean, if you negotiate a deal, let's say it this way. If I negotiate a deal for a buyer and they're unrepresented all the way through, and I'm acting on the seller's behalf, and we negotiate and we get a signed contract, and at the time they bring us the signed contract, they say, okay, all of a sudden now I'm represented by my brother-in-law. Well, there's no compensation that is in the purchase agreement to pay the brother-in-law. Okay. So, I mean, the seller's not, I mean, the contract is really not changed if they swoop in at the very end, unless they come in at the last end and try and negotiate, a payment to their brother-in-law. Then it can be sticky. So, let's hope that doesn't happen. Okay. Seller's broker will act as the agent of seller exclusively during any negotiation of transaction regarding the property. I think that's pretty clear. Statutory agency confirmation compliance applies to sales and leases over 1 year. Seller's broker shall confirm the agency relationships described above or as modified in writing prior to or at the same time as seller's execution of a purchase agreement. So, what that's saying is that when you get to the very end of a purchase agreement and everybody's ready to have acceptance, you have to have in the purchase agreement, seller's broker is Mark Dolan at RE/MAX Big Bear. Buyer's broker is unrepresented. Or
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you go from the non-agency agreement when you're showing the property because they are unrepresented to then they decide to work with you and then you roll them into the other one and then therefore they can't do that where they can use their in-laws or something?
Yeah. But it would have to be with their consent. Okay.
Right.
So, I mean, so this, this box here says, they're allowed to enter into an agency relationship with a real estate licensee other than the seller's broker at any time during the negotiation or transaction. I mean, it doesn't say that they could enter into an agency relationship with you, but I think that's self-evident. I mean, I think it is. I mean, you could enter that agreement at any time as well. Okay. Other advice: buyer is advised to seek real estate, legal, tax, insurance, title, and other desired assistance from appropriate professionals. I think that makes sense. Okay. Any questions on that form from anybody?
Can we just convince them not to, even know that this form exists, and we just stick with the other?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, again, the biggest hurdle of all of this for everyone is that the game has changed. Okay. And the greatest discomfort is trying to make the new world make sense with the old world. And that, I mean, it's like a race. Take a look at what the new world looks like. Let's figure out how to use these documents to our benefit and to protect ourselves. And what's even more important was shared by the guy that taught the class last week is in order to show our value, you think, I mean, all of the real estate people that are shaking their heads, ringing, just going beyond belief with anxiety over the forms changes and the way that everything is going. What do you think our clients are doing? I mean, if the people, the professionals in our industry are struggling, what do you think the public is doing with it? The greatest sense of value you can give them to them is say, I understand these documents. You don't need to go hire an attorney. You don't need to worry about it because I'm going to guide you through it. And here's how this works. And here's how I'm going to protect you. And here's what I get paid for it. And coming across that way, they're going to want to use you because it's not the old world. They're going to be talking with people, I don't know what's going on. Well, they don't want to work with them. They're going to want to work with somebody that's comfortable with it. Okay. So this is an important form, particularly when you're representing a seller, you have a listing, or you're showing a buyer that's unrepresented, that's looking at another RE/MAX listing. You could do that as a courtesy. Tanya could say, hey, I'm out of town today. Evan, would you, show my listing today, as a courtesy because I'm not there, or one of your team members could do that. And you send off the buyer non-agency agreement and have the guy sign it before you open it up. And you can do that as long as it's a RE/MAX listing. Okay.
But real quick, doesn't it say that if the buyer's not represented, and you go out and, represent your seller by showing it to them and they sign this and you check the box that says they're not represented at this time, right? But yet they do have the right to enter a relationship with a real estate licensee other than the seller's broker at any time. Doesn't that other than the seller's broker really limit them working them into a buyer's rep agreement with any RE/MAX agent?
No.
It kind of reads that way though.
Yeah. Well, I think you can come up with that interpretation, but what I think it is more of a disclosure for us. It's more of a warning to us that's saying, you may have brother-in-law agent or neighbor down the hill agent, stepping in the middle of the negotiation. We've had that happen already.
Sure.
Long before this ever happened. So I think it's more of that thing. If you wanted to be super legal and to be super technical, you could do an addendum that says, the buyer non-agency agreement signed on, August 17th is no longer valid. It's null and void. And
it would seem like you have to, but yeah, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean,
Sure.
if you wanted to get technical, I think you could do that. So, let's go on to a similar document.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
So if I have an agreement with my client, I'm their agent for buying property, showing them properties, but I have now gone on vacation for 2 weeks. My teammate is going to now show property for me on my behalf. What form do they use, or do they need one? Or are they bound under mine?
There is a form for that, and I don't have it on the top of my head, so I'll have to come back to that, answer that question.
Okay, so it's not
yeah.
that non-agency one. It's not one of
It's
those.
it's not a non-agency one. I mean, if you have and this is particularly for teams, if you are on a team where there are 2 members or 10 members, doesn't matter how many members are on the team, there is a document that says that the buyer is working with any of the people that are on that list of the people that are on the team. And I'll find out what that is and I'll follow up with you guys later on that. Okay, so
Are you talking about the AAA?
I think that's the one, additional
Yeah.
agent.
Additional agent, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that's that's a great document for teams. So you don't want to be signing. I mean, the reality is, what Tanya was just saying is I have a buyer representation agreement with a buyer and I'm out of town and they go out with Aaron to look. I mean, are they covered? Do they have to sign a new buyer broker agreement? You just do that additional agent thing and that should cover it. Let's see. AAA, Becky's got it. Perfect. Okay. The open house visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in is very similar to the non-agency, but it's for a specific use. It's for open houses. And when you are holding an open house, assuming you are holding an open house on a RE/MAX brokerage listing, this would be valid. I think this would make it very difficult to hold open house for somebody's listing that doesn't work with our company. Okay. Property address 123 Main Street, the real estate agents that are there. If you're a team and there's 2 agents that are there, Gene and Rich Thomas, they could put their name in there. So you can have multiple agents that are in there. It doesn't have to be your listing. The agents that are on site are the ones that are doing this. Real estate broker is RE/MAX, Big Bear, of course, and the date. So this is a login sheet that is designed to do that non-agency disclosure for people that are in the house, because when they walk in, you're not supposed to be showing property to people you don't have an agreement with. Well, you have an agreement with the seller, so you have to have the buyer sign an agreement that says that you don't represent us, you represent the seller, and then you can look at the house. So the visitor's intention to view the property, an agent is holding an open house or conducting in-person or live virtual tours of the property identified above. Visitor is interested in viewing the property. Agent agrees to show property to visitor on the following terms and conditions. Agent does not represent visitor. That's pretty straightforward. We don't represent you, okay? Unless otherwise agreed in writing. If you have a buyer broker agreement, that's different. But if you don't, you're not working on behalf of the buyer, okay? Communication with agent at the open house is for the benefit of the seller. Any communication or sharing of information that agent has with the visitor during the open house property tour regarding the property is for the benefit of the seller. All acts of the agent at the open house property tour, even those that assist visitor in deciding whether to make an offer on the property, are the benefit of the seller exclusively. What if if the buyer says, oh, I'm really interested in the house, is it worth it? And you open up your computer and provide them comps and say, here are the comps for it. This is a great deal. You should buy it. Okay. This is saying even providing comps to them is for the benefit of the seller, okay? Communication with an agent are not confidential. Any information the visitor reveals is going to be passed along to the seller. We have a fiduciary duty with them. If the visitor writes an offer on the property through agent at that time, agent will disclose if agent and agent's broker represent the seller exclusively or both the seller and the visitor. So what that means is if I'm on an open house and Maureen says, I want to buy this house. We've been looking for 3 months and this is the house we want to buy. Would you write the offer for me? Great. So now we're going to discuss, am I representing the seller only or am I representing you in the transaction? Well, we want you to represent our interest too. Great. What's our fee? What's your fee going to be? Well, it's 3%. Well, can we negotiate that? Well, maybe you negotiate it to 2. I don't know what you decide to do. But we can decide there on the spot if I'm going to represent the buyer as well. Guess what I would have to do? Sign a buyer representation agreement with the agreed upon fee for representing them at the time that I write the offer. Make sense? Okay. I don't expect that that's going to happen a lot. I think it will happen sometimes. If the visitor wants to be represented by the agent holding the open house, visitors should sign a representation agreement with the agent holding the open house, such as a property showing and representation agreement, which we're going to go over next, or the buyer's representation and broker compensation agreement. If visitor is an exclusive relationship with another agent, this is not intended as a solicitation of the visitor, okay? So people may be walking into your open house that have another agent. So if you're holding an open house and you've got people walking in, you're going to want to send them to this and say, hey, we got to take care of this right now. You know, do you have an agent that you're under contract with? Yes or no? You know, and if they do, well, let's put their name there. Let's put your name, email address, or phone number. You can give me your agent's email and phone number if you want, but have everybody sign that. And you know, the advice that we've gotten from NAR counsel on this is that if you are holding an open house and a buyer comes in and they refuse to sign the login thing, the advice from the NAR attorney was, don't talk to them, hand them the flyer.
But can they still see the house?
That would be up to your seller, I think. Yeah.
I have another question about this. So do you just have one representative from each party sign this form? One, I mean, how many signatures do you have to get? And my other question was, I had an agent come in with her buyers and she signed this, but is that even necessary?
I think so. I mean, and the reason why I think it's important to have the non-agency disclosure signed or this open house visitor signed is that we're trying to really clarify in this new world who the agent is. You know, the biggest complaint that we have of out of area brokers is their lack of expertise and the increase of liability that we incur because people that don't know what they're doing are representing clients within our area. And having everyone sign a non-agency disclosure sort of softens a lot of that for us. I mean, I'll give you an example, is if you represent a buyer on a purchase and there's a lawsuit, it's our E&O insurance that gets hit. If they're undisclosed, it's not our E&O insurance on their behalf. I mean, they've got to self-defend. Their agent's got to self-defend. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes. So if they come with an agent, have the agent sign this document, and if they come in a group, we can accept one person's contact information?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
And if they're just a neighbor looky-loo?
Sign it. Yeah, have them sign it. Yeah. Hey, and if they complain, just say, this is your government at work, baby. This is them. Okay. So I don't have a whole lot more on this form. I mean, I think it's really important that we understand when we are not the agent for the other person and that we get them to acknowledge that to lower our liability. That makes sense. Okay. So the next form that I'm going to go to is what I call the baby form, the baby buyer broker agreement. Okay. The broker compensation advisory is the full thing that has exclusive representation, and I call it a marriage contract. This document here is a dating contract. That makes sense.
You've got the big one up, Mark.
I got the big one up. Yeah, let's go back to the other one. No. What did I?
You know what? While you're looking for it, back to Mike's original question about the BNA, and then they decide to use you. It seems to me like instead of doing the BNA when you go to open up one of your seller's houses, you use this form instead. And then if they decide to write up the offer, you're covered. And you don't have to modify the BNA or amend it.
Well, you wouldn't have to. Yeah, you wouldn't have to. So I don't know if my screen is jacked up now or not, or if it's right. Does it look good to you guys? Because I've moved it around a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the property showing and representation agreement. It's a buyer representation agreement, but it's more of a dating contract than a marriage contract. Okay. Some of this stuff I think is going to be pretty self-explanatory. Prospective buyer, who the broker is. Important things about this, it's only good for 3 properties. It's only good for 3 properties and it's only good for 30 days. Okay, so this is sort of a test trial kind of agreement. This is the one I think that would be the easiest to get somebody to sign. It's probably the most appropriate for somebody that you see at an open house, that is a walk into the office, and you're going to be spending a little bit of time, with that day. If it's going to be less, 3 properties or less, and it's, a very, it's just sort of a trial run kind of thing, this would be the document to use. Okay. Not a whole lot shorter than the other one, and a lot of the terms are the same. So let's go through it pretty quickly. I'm going to go through each of the lines. Show or tour property, broker agrees virtually or in person to show or give a tour of the properties identified above to the prospective purchaser. So what that means, you get a Zillow lead, you get a Realtor.com lead, you get a sign call lead. You are not allowed to do a video tour for a prospective buyer on a listing other than your own, because you're representing the seller in that case, without some kind of a representation agreement. So if you get a lead that says, and you say to them, I'll go video tour the 3 houses that you're interested in, this would be the perfect form to do, because you have to have authorization to do a virtual tour with somebody. You have to have a written agreement with them. Make sense to everybody?
Yeah, Mike, I've got a question.
Yeah.
In the village, guy walks in, says, show me 3 houses in that 750 price range. Is that a virtual tour if we walk through all the snapshots and if there is a virtual tour on that listing?
You mean at the window?
No, he was at the window, we talked to him. He sat down and he's looking at our big screen now.
Oh, you're talking about sitting in the office, going through pictures and stuff?
Yes, sir, and a virtual tour.
Yeah. I would not say that a representation agreement is required to sit at your desk, because I would call that a consultation appointment. I think it applies when you go out virtually to the house with your camera or your phone and you're transmitting video to him in a remote location. That's what I would call a virtual tour.
Okay, even if that virtual tour is done by the listing agent and I'm the buyer's agent.
Well, if you're doing a virtual tour for a buyer on your own listing, you should have a buyer non-agency agreement.
Okay, I think I get it.
Yeah. So if the buyer says, hey, I'm interested in your house, would you go do a video tour with me? Do you want me to be your agent? No. Well, then I need you to sign this buyer non-agency disclosure. And then you can go do the tour. If you are showing things that are not your listing, I mean, a Keller Williams or a Coldwell Banker listing, for example, then you would need to have some kind of a buyer agency because you don't represent the seller.
Oh, I have a big question on that then. Okay. So right now I've been working with different buyers, let's say for the last 6 months. And throughout the last, 6 months, once in a while, the property comes up and they go, ooh, I'm not sure if I like that one. Would you do a video walkthrough? Sure. I do a video walkthrough, send it to their phone. And they go, yeah, you know what? We're not going to come up. That's not the one for us. Okay. So we wait another one. So I do not have a representative agreement with these people because it's just new. Obviously, this is just changed now, right? Do I now send it to them DocuSign or say, I'm sorry, until you get up here the next time, I'm not showing you anything by video anymore?
Well, you have a relationship with them. I think it would be pretty easy to, at the end of going through the buyer representation agreement, I think it would be pretty easy for you to you say, hey, Mary Lou and Joe, we've been working well together for the last 6 months. Hey, there's a new settlement and I have to have a written agreement with you, in order to continue to show you property and do the video tours and things that we've done in the past. So I'd like to go through it with you if you don't mind, and send it to you for your signature so I can keep doing those video tours. How does that sound?
And DocuSign is allowed.
DocuSign is allowed, yeah.
Okay. And then that's where also at this point I have to say to them, by the way, FYI, there's a commission, and explain all that as well. Obviously,
Yeah. Yeah.
Because before, obviously, there was never discussion of commission, so.
And to me, the easiest thing is to say is for, I don't know how many, I'm going to use the number 38. I've been in the business 38 years, and you can say I've been in the business whatever number of years, and for all of those years, the seller has paid the buyer representation commission out of the purchase price. And they never let the buyer really know what it was. Well, I mean, typically the typical fee has been anywhere from 2.5% to 3%. My fee's 2.5%. And the only thing that's different now, really, from before, is that the seller and the listing agent aren't going to dictate what that is. You and I are going to discuss it. And so if you're comfortable with that same arrangement, when we present offers, we're going to ask the seller to pay for it. And if you're comfortable with 2.5%, go ahead and sign here. Press hard. The fourth copy is yours is the script I learned 40 years ago. Okay. That's not the script we use now, but you just ask them to sign it. Yeah, they'll sign it. It's really no different. We're going to ask the seller to pay it just the way they've always done it. The only difference is now is that you got to say in what the amount is. That's all.
Well, and also, I mean, this might be weird, but a lot of times I don't talk or meet people literally until the day I'm showing. Like we might be in text messaging, emails, and then maybe the day of we go, hey, seeing you at 1 o'clock today, I'll meet you at the office, and then we're going to go look at property. That's going to have to be revised too, because we can't do something last minute. Oh, let me, by the way, get you to sign this real quick. Like,
Well, you're gonna want to do that up front. Yeah, you're gonna want to do that up front. Yeah. Okay, so virtually or in person, you have to have the agreement. Right to represent prospective buyers grants. Whoop, who's that?
Mark, that's me.
Yeah. Mhm.
So can't that buyer broker agreement be sent out virtually for signature, DocuSign, ahead of time?
Yes.
Okay, and the other question I have, or just a thought on the 3 property showings. So what if they want to see more than 3 properties? And I've heard some agents talk about, well, we'll just fill out another one of these forms at the same time and put those properties on another form. Or do you show the 3 properties and then fill out another one of these to identify the 3 properties? And then they want to see 3 more or 2 more or whatever. Do we just fill out another one?
Well, I think what I would do, I mean, theoretically, there's very few people in Big Bear that only want to see 3 properties. I mean, that's pretty rare that happens. When there's plenty of inventory, it's pretty rare that happens. So I think, if you're intending to look at 3 or less, I would go with this one to start. And just say, there's other properties I'd like to show you. Are you comfortable with our work so far? Would you be comfortable having me represent you in the same way, but not limited to 3 properties? I mean, there's 400 properties in our MLS. Would you be comfortable with that arrangement with all the properties in the MLS? Let me show you anything that works for you. I think a lot of people would say yes to that, and then you would just go straight to the buyer representation agreement. So, I mean, I don't think I would do 10 of these so I could show them 30 properties. I think I'd do 1 or maybe 2 and then say, hey, let's make this a forum. Let's get married. We've dated so well. Let's get married. I think that's
But we could date for 5 properties and fill out 2 of these.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So the right to represent prospective buyer grants the broker the non-exclusive, that's important, non-exclusive. They can sign other buyer representation agreements with other people when it's non-exclusive. To represent the buyer in acquiring the properties identified above in the following terms and conditions. So even these 3 properties here is non-exclusive. So there's not a lot of teeth in this document. I mean, they got to still like you after you've shown them the property, they got to still like you. Okay. Terms of representation. The items in this paragraph are contractual terms of the agreement. Reference paragraphs provide further explanation. This form is 3 pages. Prospective buyers advised to read all 3 pages. Okay. Representation period beginning on this date goes to another date not to exceed 30 days. So this is really a short-term dating contract. or upon completion of a resulting transaction, whichever occurs first. Broker compensation notice, the amount of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. That's a big thing. They're putting it everywhere. The amount of compensation, you can put in a percentage of the acquisition price, or you can put in a flat fee, or yeah. Okay. Payments received by broker from seller. If broker receives compensation from seller or others pursuant to the term of a prospective buyer's offer to purchase, or otherwise, the amount shall be credited against prospective buyer's obligation to pay broker. So let's say if, for example, this buyer broker agreement is at 3% and the seller, it says, I'm just not paying 2%, and your buyer says, that's fine. The 2% that the seller pays you will be credited against the obligation, and the buyer would only owe you 1% at close of escrow. That's what it's saying. Okay. I really don't like this term, cancellation rights and notice effective upon receipt. So that means if you don't check this box, you could sign this agreement at 10 o'clock on a Saturday, go show 3 properties at 2 o'clock, come back into the office and receive a cancellation and it would be canceled 4 hours later. So I don't think I like you guys leaving that box empty. I think I'd probably put 7 days or 3 days or some amount so you can have some discussion to try and figure out what's going on if that happens. Okay. The amount of real estate commissions, a lot of this is boilerplate, but it's important to read. It's not fixed by law. They're set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker and are fully negotiable. Okay. So when you hear bonuses, bonuses are going to be tied into this limit. Okay. If you have a buyer broker agreement or this document here at 2.5% and the seller says, I'm willing to pay you a $5,000 bonus, you don't get the $5,000 bonus because you're not allowed to get that unless the buyer says it's okay.
Say that again, Mark.
Yeah, if the amount of compensation is when you have an amount in here, 2.5%, 3%, whatever the amount is that you've negotiated, that's all you can receive. You cannot receive any more than that. Let's say that you're a discount broker and you decide you're going to do these things at 1%. And you're talking with a listing broker, and the listing broker says, oh, my seller will pay 4% or 3% or whatever. You can't get it. You can only get what you have in here. Okay. Any amount over and above that either has to be rejected outright and given back to the seller, or to be transferred to the buyer, and you have to negotiate that if it's offered.
Okay, and that selling bonus at the close of escrow is part of that, huh?
Yeah, yeah.
I have a question. If that ends up being this, which would be extremely rare, wouldn't you just, if the seller is willing to pay you more, wouldn't you just do a modified terms on your buyer broker agreement?
Only if the buyer is willing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, if the buyer is willing. Yeah.
Are you guys talking about like when a seller in the notes, it would say, hey, they're really motivated, so they're offering $2,500 if you bring in a buyer and they close escrow by August 31st. Is that what you're talking about then?
You can't even offer that in the MLS anymore, so that's gone.
Oh, that's not a commission though.
Well, that's why they changed the word to compensation.
So they can't offer any compensation.
Not to the buyer. Well, they can't offer it through the MLS. Somebody could offer it to you on a flyer. Somebody could offer it to you in a personal phone call. But if your buyer broker representation agreement has a percentage in, that's the total compensation that the buyer and you have agreed to receive for his representation. And
so pretty much the sellers are not going to just offer any additional amount anyways then at this point, because we'd have to advise them as a seller. If they said, look, I really want to sell this, give them another $5,000 if they bring an offer. No, we can't do that. We can only offer them commission. We can only offer them to accept what they're asking for in commission.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think purely, you know, the way it's going to get purely is that a buyer and the buyer's agent are going to negotiate their fee. They're going to present an offer asking the seller to pay the fee. And the seller is going to say, yes, I think offers of compensation are going to go away. I mean, I don't think brokers, I don't think sellers are going to be offering anything. I think they're going to check the box that says we're willing to entertain offers where we pay compensation, but they're not going to give an amount, and the market is going to decide. So whatever you negotiate on your buyer broker fee is probably what you're going to end up getting. Hopefully that's what you're going to be getting. And that's why I don't want sellers negotiating my fee. They've been negotiating my fee for 40 years. I don't want them doing it anymore when I'm representing a buyer.
I think if we can get buyers and sellers to focus on a win-win between them, it should work. And if they start focusing on negotiating the compensation of the listing and or buyer's agent, it's not going to go well. Like if that, you know, and that's, you could see that happening, but just like you were talking about earlier, that's a little, I don't know how it's going to work.
Yep. Okay, so we have the amount, payments received from broker, you know, from the seller are going to be offset or credited. Cancellation rights, we talked about that. This is sort of important, you know, this whole thing, and this is consistent with the other agreement as well. The broker right to compensation. Brokers shall be entitled to compensation specified in paragraph 4B1, which is up here, from prospective buyer if during the representation period or any extension prospective buyer is shown the property by broker, so showing, prospective buyer enters into an agreement to purchase, so they write an offer or a lease, or otherwise acquire the property. I don't know how you could acquire it other than a purchase or a lease, but and the seller thereafter completes the transaction or is prevented from doing so by default of prospective buyer. So if those things happen, even if I mean, it's very much like a listing contract. When you have a listing contract that says the seller's going to pay you 6%, if you bring a ready, willing, and able buyer at $2 million and you bring a ready, willing, and able buyer at $2 million, you've already earned the fee as a listing broker. In the old days, you'd already earned the fee because you brought the buyer willing and able to do it. And if the buyer didn't move forward, you could sue him for this, you know, $120,000 commission, you know, if you wanted to. Doesn't happen a lot, but you could. So in this same way, your compensation is earned when these things take place. And even if the deal doesn't close, let's say that the buyer were to cancel at the last minute because they changed their mind, they removed all their contingencies, they did everything they could up until the last moment, and then they said, you know, we changed our mind, we're not going to buy it. Well, you'd still be entitled to your fee. Okay. Non-exclusive representation, broker involvement. When it's non-exclusive, in order to earn your fee, you have to have some of these conditions in place. You have to physically enter and show the property to you know, by the broker. Now you could do that virtually, which is the next line, or physically. If you submit the seller a signed written offer from the prospective buyer to acquire it, that's broker involvement. If you perform a market analysis related to the property or reviewed property specific documents like disclosures with the buyer, you went and got permits, that's broker involvement. Okay. The property was introduced to prospective buyer by the broker or one of which broker acted on a prospective buyer's behalf. This is probably the one that has the most gray area to it. If I send an email and pictures and some specific non-MLS related information to my buyer that I have under contract, and I said, you know, hey, I previewed this today. I think it might really be something that's good for you. That would be considered broker involvement because I introduced it to them. But if I sent them or I put them on a drip campaign, you know, and emails were being sent automatically to them every other day or every day or whatever, and it got sent to them through that drip campaign through the MLS, that would not be broker involvement. If it was on my website and they saw it, that would not be broker involvement. That makes sense. I mean, you have to actually do something on behalf of your buyer other than be, you know, breathing in and out in order to have some involvement. So, you know, if a buyer can argue that you didn't do any of those things and they buy something, you would not be able to hold them to it. I don't know why they put that in there, because if you identify 3 properties here, that's, I think that's broker involvement right there. Even if you didn't take them into the property, okay? Timing of compensation is payable when the property closes. If it's prevented by default of the buyer, if it's prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer, and the buyer prospect collects damages by suit, settlement, or otherwise. So how does this work? So let's say that the seller breaches the contract and the sale never closes, and the buyer sues the seller, and the buyer gets awarded damages of $130,000. You'd be entitled to your commission at that point. The seller breached the contract to the buyer, the deal didn't close, the buyer got money in compensation, so you deserve to get paid. Hopefully that makes sense for everybody. Payment through escrow, I think that's pretty straightforward. Either the seller's going to pay you through escrow at the close, or the buyer has to submit money to escrow in order to pay you, and that's when you get paid, is at the closing. Accounting for payments to broker if the broker also represents the seller. If the broker has signed listing agreement with the seller of the property to be purchased, prospective buyers shall not receive a credit for the compensation seller owes broker for representing seller. Okay, so think about this. I have a listing agreement, the seller's paying me 3%. I have a buyer broker representation agreement with my buyer at 2.5%. And we negotiate a transaction where the seller agrees he's going to pay me the 3% he owes me, and he agrees to pay me the 2.5% for representing the buyer, right? And then all of a sudden the buyer comes back and says, hey, now wait a second. You received 5%, 5.5% from the seller. You have to give me the extra 3%. What I'm being paid for representing the seller is not to be credited to the buyer. It's only the buyer's portion that's credited. Make sense? Hopefully that does to everyone. Okay. This is, you know, I know I'm going on a long time. We've been at this an hour and a half. So, you know, I'm going to share with you all one thing before I quickly go through the rest, because I don't want to, you know, take up all day with all of you, because we're probably going to have to come back to it again. Is that whenever I'm sitting down with a client to go through the paperwork, there's always been 3 different kinds of people to me. One person doesn't want to read the documents and just wants to sign. You ever had one of those people, just give me the thing, I just want to sign it. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but there are people that say that. The second question that I ask people is, do you want to read it? And I'm hoping to heck they don't want to read every page in the contract. You know, but, you know, if they do, then you're sitting there for about 40 minutes until they've read the first 5 pages, and then they saw the hell with it and they sign the rest of it without reading. The third option is people ask you to explain it to them in easy language for them to understand. And so that's what I want you guys to do. And that's what I'm going to try and do with the rest of the contract here, is sort of give you the highlight of what each of these paragraphs say, because you want to be able to know the contract well enough that you know it better than your clients. Because if you don't, they don't need you. And if they're really concerned about legal ease, they're going to hire a contract, or they're going to hire an attorney to read the contract. Okay. So an example of that: payments received from others less than the prospective buyer compensation obligation. What this paragraph says is that, you know, if the seller pays me 2% and your agreement with me is 3%, that means that you're going to still owe me 1% after we've applied that 2% to your obligation. Okay. That's what that paragraph says. Cancellation of representation agreement. Because this is non-exclusive, this agreement is non-exclusive, they can cancel the agreement by giving you written notice within the time frame that was specified up above. There was one that said upon receipt. The other option was to check a box, and you could have put in 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, whatever it was that you want. Okay. It talks about, you know, the broker shall still be entitled to compensation if during the representation period Buyer acquires property for which there was broker involvement, provided broker delivers to prospective buyer a written list of those properties for which there was broker involvement. So this is sort of protecting yourself. They cancel the agreement and you say, hold it, hold it, hold it. You can cancel the agreement. We won't work anymore. But those 3 properties I showed you, if you buy one of those, you still owe me compensation. Okay. This phrase here, C, is it's telling the buyer is that you need to notify any new broker that you're working with what your obligations are to me. Agency relationship disclosure, broker will provide prospective buyer with a disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships as soon as practical prior to writing an offer. So you may sign this document at an open house saying, I'm going to show you 3 properties. And if they decide they want to write one, the first thing you want to do is give them an agency disclosure and have them sign it. Okay. Broker authorizations and obligation. I think that's similar language to everything else that we've seen in all of the other documents. Same thing with buyer obligations. Important. Anytime you see something in a box, they think it's important. You are not required to sign a representation agreement to see this property at an open house. So if they're at an open house, you don't have to sign this. You have to sign the open house disclosure. If you do not want the agent holding the open house to represent you, then you should not sign this form, and you should read and understand the open house visitor non-agency disclosure. What they're afraid of is that agents are going to try and trick buyers into signing this agreement when they're in the house at the open house. To all prospective buyers, if you have already signed a representation agreement with another broker, you should inform the broker of the name of that other broker and provide a copy of that agreement, or request broker to obtain a copy from the other broker. If you have already signed a representation agreement with another broker, you sign this form, you may be obligated to pay 2 different brokers if you purchase this property. Same thing as having 2 listings in place. Okay. Again, this document is very, very similar to the buyer representation agreement. This is the marriage contract. It goes into a lot more things. Some things are similar, so I'm not going to talk about them. What I'm going to talk about is different. Okay. You can do this one for 3 months, not 30 days. Can't exceed 3 months. You're going to have to extend it after 3 months. Type of representation. This is non-exclusive or exclusive. Pretty important to know the difference. Non-exclusive means that you have to have that broker involvement, or you have to do something more than just breathing in order to get paid. I mean, you have to do more than the other broker if somebody else writes it. When it's exclusive, it's the same as an exclusive listing. It means you could be asleep. You could be in a coma for 3 months. If they buy a property during that period of time, you're entitled to the compensation. Okay. Obviously, from our standpoint, an exclusive representation agreement is what we want. It remains to be seen who's going to use this form in an exclusive capacity. There's some interesting things in here, and as I say that this is more of a marriage contract, there's some additional forms that are in here, additional buyer preferences and priorities. So if you are going to really be going in deep with a prospective buyer and you want to show your value to them, there is a form called the BIPP, which is a buyer identification of preferences and priorities. It's basically a checklist of what the buyer says are important to them about what they want. So if you're trying to have a really deep, meaningful marriage relationship with this particular buyer, that might be something that you add and ask them to fill out so you know exactly what they're looking for. It's just a higher level of representation. They may exclude some things from the agreement. You know, they may have a brother-in-law that has a house on Sonoma that they may buy, and they don't want to pay you if they buy their brother-in-law's house on Sonoma. The big disclaimer, they're not fixed by law. We go into the compensation again. We're going to go into this. Cancellation is different. Non-exclusive cancellation is just like the other form. It can be upon receipt, or you can put in some days. If it's exclusive, if the agreement is exclusive, then the cancellation is effective 30 days after receipt. So if you have an exclusive relationship, they can't cancel with you and go buy, from somebody else 5 days later. There's a mourning process for this one. Okay. When you have this agreement, there is a time frame to deliver buyer's personal financial information. It says within 5 days from the execution of this agreement, or some other amount, they're going to give you their personal financial information. Pre-qualification, pre-approval, bank statements, whatever it is that you need, to show that they are qualified. This agreement is asking for that within 5 days. There is another form that is here that you can check that we'll fill out, and they can give us all of that information. Okay. This is a really important box down here, G2, this one right here. It says other financial considerations. I know one of our agents has already got this document signed 5 or 6 times, and every single time the buyer checked the box. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. Think about that. On the buyer representation agreement, there is a disclosure that says the buyer doesn't have the funds to pay you. But the contract says that they're obligated to pay you. But they're saying, I don't have the money to pay you. That seems like an oxymoron, doesn't it? It seems like it could be a problem. That is a really, really important thing to check for your clients if they don't want to write a check out of their pocket. If you have a buyer broker agreement at 3% and you check this box here that says they don't have sufficient funds to pay the broker, when you send that along with your offer, you can point that out to the listing broker and say, hey, our seller to pay the buyer broker compensation is asking for 3%. That's our contractual amount. The buyer doesn't have the ability to pay that out of their pocket. They're using all of their money for the down payment and the repairs that they're doing on the house. So please respond with an offer that recognizes that the seller can, or the buyer can't pay that out of their pocket. In other words, I'm saying don't cut my commission. You guys follow that?
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a client I'm working with right now. They're cash. They do have the money, but they just don't want to pay it. So can I technically, is this to be read that they absolutely don't have the money, or they don't want to use the money they have for this particular thing?
Well, it says they do not have sufficient funds to pay broker. And then at the same time, you write a cash offer and you're giving proof of funds and you show $2 million.
Exactly.
So the seller says, well, how in the hell can't you pay it? Well, my savings cover all kinds of other things. The truth is, Maureen, is if you have a buyer broker agreement at 2.5% and you're paying cash for the house, and the seller pays it out of their proceeds, your client's still paying for it in the purchase price.
Right.
Yeah, if you weren't receiving anything, the buyer could offer, 2.5% less, in purchase price, and the seller would get the same amount of net. So,
yeah.
I think for a cash purchase, it really doesn't make sense to check that box because if you check that box that says the buyer doesn't have the cash, to pay it, the seller would say, okay, well, I'm going to counter the price $20,000 higher. And if the buyer agrees to it, then they did have the cash, right?
But technically, they're never going to see that page, because if they ask for a buyer representation agreement, you really only have to send them page 4. So they're never going to know that that box is checked, perhaps.
Well, I think I would send it. And on a cash offer, I don't think it makes a difference.
Right.
I really don't think it makes a difference. Why do you
Page
say
5, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I had a question
then-
about that too. Sorry. Yeah, you're still going.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, real quick.
Yeah, that can.
Yeah, that's the page 5 that we're only obligated to send if someone requests it. But
it says
I don't
if
know that
either
I would
box-
send the whole thing.
Well, right. It does say, and I maybe this could be explained because it doesn't make sense to me. If either box is checked, either of those boxes we're talking about, for any property, the buyer agrees to include a term in buyer's offer requesting seller to compensate. But what does that mean, include a term? You're going to do the seller payment to buyer's broker, but there's nowhere to specify that that's a contingency.
Oh,
Or
it
is there?
absolutely is. Oh, it absolutely is. When you send a purchase offer to the seller that has the box check that says, we want you to pay the buyer broker compensation, that is a term. The offer is subject to the agreement of doing that. I mean, if
Well,
the
right, the seller payment to buyer's broker is certainly a term, but the term regarding the buyer not having sufficient funds to pay the broker isn't mentioned, like Maureen said, isn't mentioned anywhere, and it says you only really provide page 5, which only has the amount. It doesn't say that they're not paying or can't pay.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be sending them page 1 also. I mean, there's nothing on page 1 that I think is going to harm, my position of saying to Maureen, my buyer doesn't have the available cash.
Mhm.
To pay the compensation out of their pocket. They're using it for other things. I mean, it could be repairs, it could be for closing costs, it could be for
Right.
furniture, what it is, but they don't have the available cash to pay it. So we've included the seller to pay that in our offer. And, we'd like your response to recognize that they don't have the ability to pay it out of pocket. They need to do it through the purchase.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yes. And real quick, on this same particular buyer, I had them sign, I've been working with them for a while, but just this last showing, I had them sign this representation agreement. And since they're higher end properties, I just did 2.5. Normally, I'm going to be doing 3, but I'm like, oh, these are higher end properties. I'm going to do 2.5. However, one of the properties they are potentially interested in, the agent said, my seller's willing to do 3%, because I asked him about, the seller offering compensation on a phone call. So my thing only says 2.5. So now I need to do a modified one. If we end up writing up that property, I need to do a modification of terms of this broker agreement to 3% so that I can ask for the 3%, correct?
Well, you can, you can. And so, I'm going to go back into what the fundamental purpose for all of this change is. The fundamental purpose of all of this change is to stop brokers from conspiring to increase commissions. I don't think that we've done that, but that's what the Department of Justice does. And so I have to ask you this question. So if you've agreed to work at 2.5% with your buyer, how would you feel if you were the buyer if they knew that you were going to get 3% because the seller was willing to pay that, and that meant that they were going to pay an extra $2,500 in purchase price to cover it? How do you think they would feel about that?
Well, I think that it would be a simultaneous thing that it's being asked, the seller's being asked to pay for it within the offer.
Okay, so again, you're my agent, Maureen, and we've got an agreement of 2.5%. Why are you encouraging me to pay you more right before we write an offer? What's the benefit to me? Because you're my agent and you have a fiduciary duty to me.
Yeah, I don't know how to word it, so I'm gonna just do them all at 3%, no matter what the price range is. And
Yeah,
then
and-
if it's less, then I'll renegotiate with my buyer.
Yeah.
And do a modification.
Yeah, and I think there's I like the idea of starting at 3 and negotiating if you need to. But I think ultimately what's going to be the most pure intent of what the Department of Justice is doing is for us to provide value to a buyer, to articulate that value to a buyer, identify what our fee is based on the value that we provide, get their agreement, their willful, their informed agreement on what our fee is, and then to properly represent them and to eliminate the discussion of what will the seller's agent pay me or what will the seller pay me. I think they're really trying to get away from that conversation where two brokers are talking about it affecting what the buyer is going to pay. I think they're trying to, they want that to be between you and your buyer. They don't want it to be between the seller, the seller's broker and you, and then having it flow down to your buyer. So.
But they're kind of making it be that way because they're putting it in the contract and then a lot of agents will be countering. So it's kind of both directions.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see whether, whether it goes to the point where seller, I mean, I'm still going to go back. Why would the seller have the right to negotiate my broker agreement? I mean, why would they have the right? They have the right to, negotiate the purchase. Okay, they have the right to negotiate the purchase. But when I go to a buyer or when I go to a seller and I say, hey, I have an offer and these people are short on closing costs, so they need you to pay $6,000 worth of closing cost in order to sell your house. And so that's included in this offer. Will you take it? And they say, well, that makes my net $3,000 lower than I wanted, so I need to counter $3,000 higher. There seems to be no objection for a seller to make that decision to sell their house to accommodate the buyer's need to put a deal together when it's closing cost. Why anybody would think that it would be different with a buyer broker fee versus a closing cost, it doesn't, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me why we would be deciding what somebody else is getting paid. I mean, we don't tell our buyers, hey, I'm going to call your boss, on Saturday, and you're no longer allowed to get $42 an hour. I'm going to tell them you only make $32 an hour now. I mean, we wouldn't do that. So, why are we trying to include that in our counter offers? So,
I think that
I keep beating my head on that one, but we'll see how it goes. I mean, it's going to be interesting.
I feel like part of the conversation though might come back to, there's so many places that it says compensation is negotiable. So a seller might try to pull that piece separately and be like, well, hey, I thought that compensation was negotiable and I don't have to pay it because it's negotiable. And I think we can get around that, of course, but I do think that that's going to get brought up because they keep saying it, that they're saying that piece loudly.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I'm trying to think of an analogy that I could explain, I think it was, can't remember which speaker it was. He said, I don't work for free. I mean, that was a script. This is my fee. I don't work. I think it was Brian Buffini. He says, I don't work for free. This is how I work. This is my fee. I don't work for free. I think that, it's important that we realize that everything needs to be by assent. Everybody has to agree. I mean, the buyers should be agreeing what they're paying us. We should be agreeing what they're paying us before we do the work. Okay. I mean, the script that sort of comes to my mind when somebody says, well, I really don't, I don't have to pay you 2.5%. So I want to pay you 1%. And I'm going to say, you're right. You don't have to pay me 2.5%, but I don't have to work for you.
Mark, that expression might be Bill don't do pro bono.
Bill, maybe it was Bill that I heard from. Yeah, I mean, this is an agreement where everybody gets to decide what they're going to do. And have I ever had a seller say, I want to cut your commission? Yeah. Am I going to have buyers that say, I want you to cut your commission? Yeah. But I don't have to do it. I don't have to do it. And neither do you. I mean, so, the script is that, no, commissions are negotiable, but in order for me to do the things that I promised you that I'm going to do, my fee is 2.5%. Unless you're going to write me a check by the hour, which I don't think that you want to do, I don't work for free and I'm not practicing. I've been doing this a long time and I'm here to properly represent you. And if I don't earn enough money to stay in business, I won't be around to help anybody in the future. So, I mean, that's the reality of it. How you say it to them, how nicely you say it to them, how effectively you say it to them. I mean, the truth is the truth is the truth is the truth. And so, no, I'm not going to work for free. I can't. I'm not practicing. Okay. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of this works out. I mean, it's exciting times, that's for sure. Let's go on through the rest of this. Dana, do you have a drop dead time that you want to do on this?
What?
So,
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, we've been doing this for a couple hours. Do you have a drop dead time you want to stop with?
1 o'clock? Is that too long? People are getting.
yeah, that is too long. I've got an appointment, so
What is-
maybe we can resume this at another day.
Yeah, finishing it another day is not gonna happen. There's too many, we need to start doing this now. So Mark, how much more time, let's put it this way, do you need?
I think where we're at right now, I can wrap it up in 30 minutes.
30 minutes?
I think I can wrap it up in 30.
And it is being recorded, so if someone. has
Okay.
an appointment,
In that case, I'll go ahead and leave you guys and then I'll look at the recording. Thank you.
Yeah, you can watch the last half hour on recording if you have to leave, but I'd rather get the whole thing on the recording if we could. And
Okay.
then we can stay. It's only another half hour. It's lunchtime. Oh. We're
Well,
hungry.
you'll be a little hungrier as we finish up here. So
You wanna take a
let me
break?
go back. Do you want to take a break?
Potty break?
Take a potty break, 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Mark, one question if I may.
Yeah.
What is the enforcement? We're gonna be screwing up here 1 or 2 times in a row. What is the penalty for screwing up? Using the wrong form, not using a form that was required?
I don't really think there's going to be, I don't think that there's going to be any, major penalties for making a mistake. I think, it's probably going to take, 60 or 90 days for the dust to settle. Where, we've been trying to prepare for this, for probably the last 3.5, 4 months. They have changed the forms a couple of times during it. There's been a lot of discussions taking place with a lot of different people, and I don't think anybody knows what the end practice is going to be. People are going to experiment with things, people are going to try things, but I think in 3 to 4 months, the dust is going to clear. There's going to be some things that people do and they're going to say, yeah, that worked for me, I'm going to do it again. Yeah, that worked for me, I'm going to do it again. Yeah, that worked for me. Well, that one didn't work, so I'm not going to do that again. I mean, we've already had some discussions going back between other brokers, where, we've had offers come in that have a buyer broker agreement and our agent, has provided a form that really wasn't the proper one, and they said, no, I don't think that works. I mean, so there's going to be a learning period of it. But enforcement and liability, I don't think there's going to be much for a while. I think everybody's just trying to work through it.
So
Yeah.
could we expect E&O to cover us then?
I'm sure they will. Yeah, I'm sure they will. But I like I said, I don't think that the E&O claim is ever going to have anything to do with the buyer broker agreement or any of these changes. Those are usually claims with damages, when a property closes. Doesn't usually have anything to do with the contract. And if there's, it's usually more about disclosure or non-disclosure and fraud, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't think any of this stuff is going to come into it. The agency part will, the agency, if you represent somebody or don't represent them and there's a lawsuit, there can be some, there can be some consequences to that.
I would suggest that there will be some screw ups for the next 3 or 4 months, huh?
Yeah. Well, I think we're working through them. I mean, everybody calls me or, when they have questions, I mean, I get emails and calls and different things and we go through that. The one thing I would share is that, I've gone through this and I have what I consider to be the best practices to the best of my ability based on what I know. And I have a real firm resolve, and I think this is the way that it should be. But the truth is that, this isn't real estate according to Mark. This is the real estate according to the way the industry goes. So in 90 days, I, may be completely different on this whole thing about, countering price. I mean, we may find out that we may find that all the buyer's agents are bringing, buyer broker agreements at 2%. I don't know what they're going to do. We're going to have to see how it plays out.
Well, thanks for your guidance anyway.
Exciting times.
Hey, Mark, I got a quick
Can I ask you a quick question? Sorry.
You could go ahead.
Go ahead. I just wanted to go back real quick. Where the box that you mark, if the lenders do not allow a buyer to pay broker commission, Fannie Mae, Freddie, FHA, do you recommend that we mark that box as well?
I would, yeah, I would check that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my quick question was, those 2 days of classes that we took, the gentleman, made it sound like, check your state, see what the law is. And California is not a law where the buyers have to sign these. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so we went over that on the BCA, the Broker Compensation Advisory. It said, that this rule is for MLS members. This is part of the MLS agreement and the industry settlement. So it's bound on any real estate licensee that's part of an MLS. This rule is in place, but it's not state law, but there's legislation before in Sacramento right now to make it law. So they're expecting January 1st of 2025 that it will be law.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, so yeah.
I
mean,
just wanted to see who's left.
So Mark, I'm unmuted now. Yes. So why don't we just do like we've been doing since DocuSign became legal? And just send them out and say, here, sign, I need you to sign this. Let me know if you have any questions. Ha ha. Whatever you do. That's what we've gotten used to doing. So now we have new forms and new rules. And it's like the old days. We had to actually either we're going to Zoom now, or you may have people sit down in front of you and just go over what they're signing and explain, like you said, the highlights, and this is what this means. And because of the new rules, I need you to sign this form.
No. Well,
And keep it, without going into trying to be a lawyer, we're just realtors
yeah.
trying to make a
Well,
living.
I think it's, it's gotten so technical and so confusing. I don't think, I mean, it makes sense to me, because I'm paying attention to what's going on. So it makes sense to me, but I think, the real estate industry is struggling with it. And a lot of it has to do with, they're looking at the past and they're saying this doesn't mesh with the past. And if we could forget what we think we know, if we could forget what we think we know and look what's put in front of us and how we can use it to move forward, I think there is a much stronger ability to represent buyers exclusively, to spend less time chasing people that are wasting our time. I think there's a lot of benefits that come along with embracing it. But the most important thing, and the guy talked about it last week in the 2 days that we did the class, is he said, the contract is important. If you can't explain the contract, if you can't make people understand it, if you can't help people to understand and be comfortable with it, and to know that you know it so well that you can use your knowledge to their advantage. I mean, if you can display your knowledge of the contracts to them, that's going to be reason for them to use you by itself. I mean,
Well,
they don't
that's
have
sort of always been the case. I mean, we are professionals. We had to get an education about how to be a realtor and about the contracts and our responsibility to that end. And so nothing has really changed. These are just new forms that we need to learn to be able to explain. It's not the end of the world. It's like, which form do I need to use? And, that's why we're going over each one. And that's why if you go on CAR, there are updated classes, to go into detail if you have a question. If obviously you're available, Mark, which is awesome for all of us, but should we get back to the forms now so we can, stick with we took a 10-minute break, Mary, we're waiting for you. No, just kidding.
Okay, so I have 21 minutes left. I'll finish up what we're doing in 20 minutes, okay? So, we're back onto the buyer representation. This is the marriage contract. A lot of this language is exactly the same, non-exclusive now with broker involvement, exclusive representation, and some of the changes that are there. We talked about that it doesn't, you can't cancel it, you have a 30-day, resting period. Talks about broker involvement. So there's a lot of repetitive stuff here. Timing of compensation, it's exactly the same as the last form that we were looking through. Payment through escrow. So all of this stuff is the same. Okay, so we really don't need to go, to go through a lot of this other stuff, what our duties are. I think this is an important, management approval. If an associate licensee in broker's office enters into this agreement on broker's behalf, broker or manager has the right to cancel this agreement in writing within 5 days after its execution. So just remember, all of these contracts you're writing belong to me, and if you write a really bad one, I can cancel it. Just joking. Okay. Again, anytime you see a box, there's something that's important there that they want to emphasize, and this is about the exclusive representation. Because exclusive, they want to make sure that the buyer knows that there are more limits to what they can do when there's an exclusive deal. You cannot enter another representation agreement that's in conflict with this. So if they've got one signed for you in Big Bear, they could sign for one in Lake Arrowhead, but they can't sign another one in Big Bear. Compensation, brokers entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period, even if the agent's in a coma at closing. Okay, you don't have to do anything. Once this agreement is signed, if they buy during the term of the agreement, you get paid. Also talks about the cancellation, which says that there's a 30-day cooling off period. So that'll prevent people from canceling with you and then trying to find another broker the next week or, 10 days later to go buy a house. Okay, and they have to initial it again. Confirmation of compensation has it in there. This is that page that they were talking about that you have to provide if you're asked, for confirmation that there's an agreement in place. Okay. I'm not going to talk about that anymore unless there's any other questions. Okay. So let's talk about when you receive an offer, when you're writing an offer, the seller payment to buyer's broker. So in the residential purchase agreement, there's a box that you click that says that you're asking the seller to pay the buyer broker obligation. And this form pops up. It says the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated. You have dated property that you're making the offer on, in which your client is the buyer, so-and-so is the seller, the buyer's broker is you. The seller's broker could be Steve Hirschler or somebody else. So you're identifying who the parties are. Really important here. Commissions aren't set by law, but they are set by broker individually. So I guess one of my answers to people, if they would say, well, I read here again that real estate commissions are fixed or not fixed by law, they're negotiable. And I would say, yeah, they are negotiable and they're not fixed by law. That's why we have a listing agreement that's a contract in place, and the buyer broker has a contract in place. So the negotiation's already been done. Write that script down. If you write anything else down, when they say real estate commissions are negotiable, you're right. We negotiated the commission with the listing agreement, and the buyer broker negotiated the commission. Now everybody's got a contract. The negotiations are over. Now we're negotiating the offer. Okay. Seller payment to buyer's broker, the amount. seller agrees to pay buyer's broker. And if you have a buyer broker agreement, you're going to want to make that exactly the same. Okay. Seller agrees to pay buyer's broker 2.5% of the purchase price, or if check that, maximum seller payment obligation. Seller shall only be obligated to pay buyer's broker the lesser of the amount in 1A. Where's 1A? 1A here, the lesser of the amount, 2.5% there, or what's on the buyer broker agreement. So I'm not sure why they put that in there, because I would be sending this in with the offer and I would make sure that this amount is exactly the same thing that I have on my buyer broker agreement. So I don't know why they put that in there. If there is no buyer representation agreement, then seller has no obligation to pay the buyer's broker. So that's important, you know. So if you send this to a seller asking him to pay you 2.5%, you don't have a buyer representation agreement, and the seller finds out about it, you might lose your entire commission. So don't do that. Okay. The second thing here, it says when the buyer signs it, he's representing that he does have a representation agreement. The buyer's already signed it. He's saying, you know, when the buyer signs this, he's saying, I've already got a buyer broker agreement with my broker. I've already signed it. That's what he's saying here. He's promising that he's done that. The next item, delivery of buyer representation agreement. It says the buyer authorizes the buyer's broker to provide to escrow upon request, or to the seller or the seller's broker upon request, a copy of the buyer representation agreement identifying the compensation buyer has agreed to pay. So when the buyer, you know, signs this, he's saying you can give that page 5 of the buyer broker agreement to the seller, proving that we have this in place. You want to send this along with your offer. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So I'm going to make a comment, a practice that I don't advise, but I think it's possible that this could happen. And it comes with, you know, Maureen's scenario where the seller says, I'm only going to pay 2%. I'm not paying 2.5%. I'm only paying 2%. You could get an offer from a buyer's broker that says they want 2.5% and they have a buyer broker agreement at 2.5%. And you could send this along with the offer, and Maureen gets it, and her client says, no, I'm only willing to pay 2%. Instead of having Maureen's client sign this and make a counter offer, I would say throw this one away, and Maureen would prepare another one that's exactly the same, except change it to 2% and have the seller sign it. So instead of having the purchase agreement and counter offer discuss commissions, the seller could sign this and send it back to the buyer's broker saying, you know, I'm only agreeing to pay you 2%. Everybody follow that? Okay. So I'm saying that you can, you know, if you don't agree to what the buyer has presented with their offer, the best way to counter that is to replace this document with what your seller will pay, and have your seller sign it and send it to the buyer for the buyer's approval. If the buyer does sign it and proves it at 2%, that means that the buyer would either have to renegotiate their buyer broker agreement with their agent, or they would have to be willing to pay the extra 0.5% out of their pocket. And they can do that. That's legal.
So you're going to revise this document instead of sending a counter? That's what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, there's, yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, there is in the purchase agreement, there's a box that says, you know, attached SPBB. So the buyer's broker sends you one at 2.5%, and your seller says, no, I'm only going to do 2. Well, it's not valid if it's not signed by the buyer and seller, right? So rather than write a counter offer that says, we're going to renegotiate your fee, I would have the seller replace the SPBB, the seller to pay buyer broker, with the 2%, have the seller sign it and send that back to the buyer's broker. That would be the counter offer. That's the only term then that you're counting.
Okay.
If they agree to every other term, it's just the conversation about compensation.
And again, I'm not advising that. I don't want us doing that, but if that's what your client wants to do, that would be the method to do it.
That's a good mechanism. Yeah. So that resolves my issue. Thank you.
But now you have, so now you take that and you tell the buyer, okay, so I still need 2.5% as we had, or let's say I had 3% in our agreement, but now they're offering 2.
Right.
How are we going to make up the other 1?
Okay, so you're my buyer, and that's, so our buyer broker agreement, Tanya, you're obligated to pay me 3%.
Right.
You're
And the
obligated-
seller has agreed to pay 2. Clearly you can see there's a 1% difference.
There's a 1%, there's a 1% problem that we need to deal with, and there's 3 options to do it. We can go back to the seller and we can raise the price by 1%. We can raise the price by 1% and ask him to pay the full 3%. That's one way to resolve it. The second way we resolve it is that you write me a check for the 1% at close of escrow and put it in to make up the difference. Or, I hate to say it, I can reduce my fee to 2%. Now I'm negotiating my fee with my buyer. That's why I don't want this to be a counter offer from the seller. I'd rather have them, counter the price. But those are our 3 ways to change it. We can go back to the seller, raise the price to try and cover it. You can write me a check for the difference, or I can lower my fee.
But in regards to transparency, this is really lame. Or I call the seller agent and I go, hey, look, I'm looking for a difference here. So why don't you counter instead? Why don't you counter the price and make my buyer pay more because I want my 1%. Now now we're going back round to the.
That's the whole, I mean, that part, what you're uncomfortable with there, that's the mess that I am trying to avoid when I suggest to sellers, don't negotiate the buyer broker fee, negotiate the price. Now, there are people that are not going to do what I'm suggesting. There are people that are going to not do what I'm suggesting. I mean, clearly, I mean, that's the beauty of our business, is that it's got the entrepreneurial spirit and there's a lot of ways to put deals together. I don't want to have that hard conversation that you're talking about, but that's what the Department of Justice wants. They want that. There is a 4th option. The 4th option is to say, no, we're not going to sign it and send back the 3%. I mean, you can do that too. Okay. I mean, it only matters. I mean, if you don't have agreement, you don't have agreement. So if we're fighting over 0.5% of commission, the 2 brokers could get their heads together and say, you know what, you took a percent away from me. I'll give up 0.5% with my client if you give up 0.5% with your client. You can have that discussion with the other broker and then go back and offer it to your client if you want to put the deal together. But those are your options. One is to say, we're going to counter the price higher to cover it. You pay me the difference. I cut my commission, or I try and negotiate something with the other broker to have him split some of the haircut that I'm taking. Make sense? But I think everybody's got this form. I mean, this form is pretty straightforward. So I wanted to go to the residential listing agreement because I think all of these changes has just as much of a, let me go to this one. Okay, so in our listing agreements, there is a multiple listing service addendum that is in our new listing agreement. Okay, very important document. What is the MLS? It talks about that. What information is in there? What is a broker's MLS? Benefit of using the MLS? A lot of this stuff was already in the purchase agreement before. It's also in the listing agreement. It talks about a lot of this stuff in the old forms. There's a reduction of exposure if you don't put it in the MLS. There's a whole lot of stuff in here that they put together. They talked about the clear cooperation policy, which means that you cannot advertise a listing to the public before you put it into the MLS. A lot of that stuff is in here, but there's some really important things that are in this new form that you need to be aware of. Seller instructs broker to market the property to the public at the beginning of the listing period. Sometimes we want to hold it while we're waiting for pictures, or we want to hold it for some reason. It's off market for 2 weeks while we're getting landscaping done. You can check the box. Seller instructs broker to begin marketing the property to the public on, and they can put in a date. So that's part of this new form. You've seen that language elsewhere, but now it's in this form. Clear cooperation policy does not apply. None of the MLSs that we have don't have clear cooperation, so you're never going to check that box. Seller elections, seller authorizes the MLS to make all listing information available to internet sites. That means that, you know, you click all the boxes and it gets, you know, harvested out to all of these other, Realtor.com, Zillow, ColdwellBanker.com, Remax.com, you know, that's the default. But the seller can also elect to opt out of certain internet features as provided by additional forms. So if your seller said, you know, I don't want my information all over the internet, I want to exclude some of it, you would have to check that box, and then you'd have to add this form so they could identify where they don't want to be. That's new. Okay, so if you haven't read this form, that's new. You need to be aware of that. Seller concessions. This is a part where we check the box that says seller authorizes broker to put in the MLS that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions, if allowed under the MLS rules, which our MLS does allow, and so does CRMLS. Seller can instruct the broker, seller authorizes broker to put in the MLS that they're done, even if permitted by the MLS. No amount of possible concessions will be stated in the MLS. You can't put an amount, you can't put a percentage. All you can say is bring me an offer with your broker compensation or your concessions, and we will consider it. So we're not putting that amount anywhere, okay? Another thing that I thought was interesting is about photographs. This is sort of new to me until I read it, so I would advise all of you to read it, is that it says visitors are not restricted from taking pictures of the property. Or 2, seller instructs broker to publish in the MLS that taking of images is limited to those persons preparing appraisal or inspection reports. Basically, that's saying nobody can take pictures of my house except my authorized people. Make sense? So if you were to check this box, that would mean people couldn't do video tours of your listing. So you may want to think about that. Make sense? So this is a new document that is going to be required with all of our listings. And the most obvious thing that's important in there is whether they're willing to offer that box that says concessions will be considered when you bring an offer. Last part. Compensation. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Okay. Compensation that's important here. Compensation to the seller's broker. 3%, 2.5%, 4%, 6%. I don't care what you put in there. It's negotiable. But what I would suggest to you is we've gotten in the habit of doing 5% commissions and doing 2.5 and 2.5. You know, that was the old way. I think if you adopt the 2.5 policy right now, you're going to find yourself that you're doing yourself a disservice. And the reason that I say that is in this new environment, there's going to be a lot of buyers that are going to be unrepresented. There's going to be a lot of discount brokers. There's going to be a lot of people experimenting with limited service, buyer representation, transactional brokerage only for less money. And what that means is that as a listing agent, you're going to be doing a lot more tasks than you would be required to do if the buyer had a full service broker. So I'm suggesting that you at least consider charging at least a full 3% now. I mean, you can charge more. I mean, I'd rather charge 4% on the listing from the seller and only offer 1% if there's an unrepresented buyer, knowing that I'm probably going to do more work for a lot of those buyers that are out there anyway. Even if they don't buy the property, I'm going to be showing properties to buyers that aren't represented, and I'm not going to be getting paid for my time unless the seller pays me. If that makes sense. So I want you guys to consider that. You put in the amount that the seller's paying you for representing them. The additional compensation to seller's broker if a buyer is unrepresented, you can put that amount in here. It could be 1%, it could be 2%, it could be any percentage that you want. I would think that people would have questions as to how you properly sell that to your seller. One of the things that I suggest to you is that if you have a fiduciary duty to the seller, that means that you have their highest and best interest always in anything that the buyer says to you. You can share with your seller. Have you ever had a buyer that says, "Oh my God, I love this house. I'll pay full price and I'll pay $20,000 outside of escrow for the furniture. I want this house. I'll do anything to get it." You ever had a buyer say that? And the answer is absolutely. Okay. If a buyer says that to you and you have a buyer representation agreement or an agency disclosure with, or an agency relationship with that buyer, you can't share that information with the seller. You're a dual agent. If you represent the seller only and a buyer says that to you, you can pass that along to your seller. And I'm telling you, I would do that in a heartbeat. I'd be telling the seller exactly everything I could do to help, his position. And so there is a major benefit for your seller to you to represent the transaction and represent them only if you can. That's a major benefit to the seller, and you should be paid for that. Okay, so you guys decide how you want to get paid for that, but just keep that in mind. Any questions on that? It is 12:30, so I'm going to open it up for any questions, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Mark, I have a question.
Yep.
So what did you call that if you are not going to be their representation, but you're going to offer to help them write contracts and do things? What did you call that position?
Transactional broker only.
Thank you.
Okay. And I'm not saying that you would do that if you have a buyer non-agency agreement with a buyer that writes an offer through you on your listing. You represent the seller. You're preparing contracts and representing the seller. Your duty to the buyer is to be fair and honest with them, but they're not represented by you. You're not working on their behalf. You're working on behalf of the seller, and you're assisting the buyer while you represent the seller in the purchase for no money.
Okay.
Hey, Mark, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason. Or Ed, it's Ed.
Okay. I think it might be a good idea, and I don't know if you've ever planned on doing this or Remax of Big Bear planned on doing this, but is there a way we can get a list of what you want us to do and what forms you want us to do before we ever talk to a client, whether it be a listing or a buyer? In other words, a sheet that says, you as a buyer's agent, you're going to take out a client for the first time. I need you to have this form. So what Remax wants.
I'll have that at the sales meeting Friday.
So
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you it's going to be one of those buyer representation agreements, one of the two that we talked
Right.
about, either the property showing and representation agreement or the buyer broker and compensation agreement. It's going to be one of those two. Otherwise, you can't show a buyer that you represent, you can't show them. But you can show a buyer your own listing and not represent them with a buyer non-agency.
Right.
So it would be one of those three. You can't cross the threshold of the door of a house without one of those three documents.
I'm just saying, I think if all of the Remax agents had that piece of paper, at least we'd all be doing the same thing.
Perfect. Actually, I won't wait till Friday on that. I will make sure we send that out in an email.
Oh, Mark, Nicole.
I have a question. Can you pull up that residential listing agreement again? I don't know if I have an older copy or you do, but on 2C2, mine says does not apply for dual agency. Am I looking at an old one or am I? There's no date. Oh,
Okay, so I'm pulling this up. So
under where it says additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer's unrepresented, the copy I have in parentheses right under that in the same little box says does not apply to dual agency. See?
well, if you have dual agency, If you have dual agency, then you are not unrepresented buyer.
Yeah, I think you have an older copy because the new ones don't have it.
Yeah, so this, I mean, I pulled this up,
That was
um,
revised on 7/24, and this one was revised. It's the same date of revision, but our copy has that written in the box.
Right.
this,
And
okay.
I printed out a listing agreement last night and it has that clause in it, does not apply. So Nicole, I think you have a more updated version unless they did it sometime between 7 o'clock last night and.
Well, and the interesting part about it, it says if broker represents both buyer and seller, buyer side compensation shall be specified in a separate written agreement.
So what?
So that would be, you're the listing agent, you have your listing agreement. Now I found a buyer, I have to have that buyer sign a buyer broker. Is that what it's referring to?
Yes.
Well, I think the, you know, the difficulty here is that, when it says additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented, is it would be virtually impossible for RE/MAX Big Bear to be a dual agency unless the buyer had signed a buyer broker agreement. A buyer, you know, somebody would not come to look at my listing and say, Melissa, would you write up, you know, Mark's listing? And I don't want you to be my agent. They would never go to a different agent other than the listing broker and say, write up the deal being unrepresented. Does that make sense?
Right.
So there's, I don't see any way that this clause, additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented, could happen unless the buyer went directly to the listing broker and said, write it up for me, but I don't want to pay you.
But I feel like they had to clarify it because that was my same question in the beginning where when I first read through this, I thought that basically was like, hey, so if I represent both sides, this is what I'm willing to do it for. That kind of tied back to an old conversation that's just not relevant anymore. And I think that not everybody has a clear understanding of how you explained it, which now it makes perfect sense. But I do feel like that is going to cause confusion.
Yeah. There's a lot to it, you know, there's a lot to it. And, yeah, every time I get a call from somebody, I learn a little bit more, you know, I like to sleep on things because, you know, we get these puzzling situations like, what the heck should we do with that? Well, I sleep on it and the next day it feels a lot better, you know, to answer that question. It's exciting time. Read the contracts and, you know, and keep up, you know, keep up with experimenting with novel ways in ways that work. I think one of the things I hear a lot of is I hear people say, well, this could happen. There's a lot of things that could happen, but the question is, what's most likely to happen? What's most likely to happen?
So here's a question. If you were asked by a seller if there's going to be increased liability or exposure in dealing with selling to an unrepresented buyer, like how would you answer that question?
Well, there's certainly a lot more liability for me with an unrepresented, you know, there's certainly because, you know, if there's a problem, they're not going to go, you know, they're not going to go for anybody else. You know, as far as a seller, I don't think that there's more liability for you. I mean, I really, other than there's not two E&O companies that are, you know, that are splitting the settlement. But I think
gotcha.
But here's the
I had that question and I didn't know what to say. I think the fiduciary thing regarding, you know, the unrepresented buyer makes sense when you're showing somebody or whatnot. But when you as a seller, when you're actually like closing an escrow with an unrepresented buyer, I know when I've had that conversation, it's been a little scary, and I don't know if there's reason for that or not.
Yeah, I don't, well, and so here's what I say, you know, the good news is you have an unrepresented buyer that doesn't have a professional that is advising them, but you do have one in me. You know, you do have one in me.
Well, they do. But yeah, you know,
you do have, you as a seller have, a professional agent representing you, and I'm going to do everything I can to shield you from exposure and any red flag, anything that I'm not going to withhold any information from you because I don't represent the buyer. And so if there's any secrets they share with me, I'm not going to withhold their secrets. I'm going to share them with you. So
I just think that transactional agent thing, to me, when these things do go to court, and they certainly will, this agency thing is going to get, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I don't know how it will work out, but it doesn't actually, like, I don't know. There's going to be some kind of precedent there, because a transactional agent with no agency relationship or fiduciary duty, like, to me, when you're giving advice, answering questions, like, you're creating an agency relationship right there, aren't you?
Well, the only difference is now is you have a buyer non-agency that's agreement that states anything that I share with you is for the benefit of the seller.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, if I'm a buyer, I want representation. I would think I would want representation, but right now, the public is, everybody's fixated on cost. Everybody's fixed on, on money. And they've forgotten about value. Everybody thinks that because all the information in the world is available on the internet, that nobody needs a professional anymore because they can find it on the internet. Well, they can find a lot of wrong information on the internet. And that's sort of it's sort of a sign of the times. And rather than, be upset about it or angry about it or, woe is me. I mean, what we have to figure out is what do we do with an environment with a lot of people that don't understand the value of a real estate agent? Well, we get good at explaining it, and we get good at demonstrating it. And the market will clean it up. The market's going to clean it up. So any other questions? I'm going to unshare this.
I have maybe one unrelated. So on all these new updated forms for the residential purchase agreement, there is a California residential purchase agreement dated 7/24, and then there's a dot, it's like a period, California residential purchase agreement dated 7/24. And I'm not sure, how do you even know which one's the newer one?
I would use the one without the dot. You can use both of them.
That's what I did, but I'm like, maybe there's something about this dot I don't know about.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else saw that, but it's interesting.
Yeah. And one last thing I'll share on, the contracts is that, we study the CAR documents and we use the CAR documents because they're done well. I mean, and it brings some continuity to it. But the thing that I want to share with you, especially in this environment, where there's all this change, is you may see a lot of purchase agreements that are not CAR documents. We've had out-of-state brokers that have written offers, they're representing themselves, but they can't receive a commission because they're not California licensees, but they're in the business, so they write their own offer and decline to be represented. So we've seen offers like that. We've seen purchase agreements that have been written by attorneys. And I would also share with you is that a purchase agreement can be written on a napkin. I mean, as long as it's acknowledged by both parties and signed and dated and the terms are written out, it doesn't even have to be written well. It can be a binding contract on a napkin. And it's pretty scary when I share that. You guys are probably saying, well, Mark, that's ridiculous. Well, it's not ridiculous. It's the law. That's the way things are. And so what I want to urge you all to do is become, as knowledgeable as you can with these forms that we're going through the changes, but realize that depending on what you're trying to accomplish with your client, the forms that we're using can be filled out completely different. So it's really important to understand how the contracts work, understand what your clients are trying to accomplish, and make sure that the contract is filled out in a way that does it the way that they want. If that makes sense. I mean, the contract has to be exactly what they're trying to accomplish. You know, and so we need to know that really, really well. And when we get something that is not on a CAR form, we have to read it and understand what they're trying to accomplish to make sure that what we're signing is what our clients really want to do. And I'll help you guys with that. When you see things that don't make sense, probably the most fun, thing for me is digging into these things and trying to figure out how they work. So if you get anything that doesn't make sense, send me a copy and we'll discuss it. Becky?
Hi, Mark. Thank you. This has been very informative. My question is that if I'm sitting down with my seller, where I'm going to take a listing, and I'm talking to him about commissions, and I can sell myself at 3%. Then I'm going to say, if there's unrepresented buyers and I end up working with one of them, would you be willing? How about if it's an unrepresented buyer, or it's a buyer that can't afford to pay their agent? Would you be willing to pay a buyer's agent commission or something like? Is that how I'm trying to word this? It's both, right? So if he agrees to pay 2.5% for the buyer's side, that would also be for the unrepresented side if I'm unrepresenting a buyer. Is that correct? It would be for both, for the buyer's agent and for me.
I'm trying to think it through. So you have a seller that does not want to list. Is that what you're saying?
No, he lists, and I sell myself at 3% because I'm going to be showing a whole bunch of unrepresented buyers probably. But let's say one of those buyers want to work with me. I want an extra 2% or an extra 2.5%. Or let's say they don't have money to pay their agent. That agent wants you to pay. It's all inclusive. It's the same thing, right? Whether it's me serving an unrepresented buyer or a buyer's agent serving that buyer, it's still that I'm talking to my seller about an amount that's for either or, correct?
So here's how I would say, here's the options. Is that me representing you? I know I'm going to be working with a lot of unrepresented buyers, serving them that are probably never going to buy the house. So it's just going to take my time and energy. So in order to represent you, my fee is 3%, and you're comfortable with that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if a buyer comes along that's unrepresented, that doesn't want to go out and hire an agent and wants me to do the transaction for them, but they're not able to pay me. They're not able to pay me, but they want to buy your house. Are you willing to pay me an extra percent to do the work that will help them buy the house? And I represent you 100%. I have a fiduciary duty to you. All I'm doing is the paperwork to assist them. Are you comfortable with that?
Okay.
And so, maybe probably it's yes. The other question that I would have for you, there's a third option, is I'm working with a buyer just like any other agent, and I have an agency relationship with a buyer. You would want me to show the buyer your house. If they were willing to pay me 2.5%, would you be comfortable with that?
Now, should I be having that conversation with them? Because any buyer, I should talk to them about a buyer's agent could be asking for a commission from them, but should I be talking about an amount for a buyer's agent when they could be making an offer, putting in 3% or whatever they want on there? And we just counter back, with a higher price. Should I even be?
I probably wouldn't have that conversation. Okay. I probably wouldn't have that conversation because any buyer that makes an offer that has a buyer representation agreement is going to ask him to pay the 2.5 or 3% or whatever the agreement is. And I'm no different, and the chances of me writing an offer on a represented buyer is probably 20-25% maybe or less. It's certainly not higher than 25%. So why would I waste my time on something that's not likely to happen?
Okay.
It's far more likely that I'm going to get an unrepresented buyer that's going to ask me to do the work for free. And so I want to have that discussion and fill out the listing agreement. And the thing that's probably most likely to happen is to receive an offer from another buyer that has a buyer representation agreement where they're going to want us to pay the fee. So I'm going to ask my seller to, consider their list price paying a full 6% commission. I want you to consider it that way. I want you to be prepared for that way. And when we get an offer, then we'll negotiate it.
You know what I'm realizing? That buyers need to be educated. They think that if they come in unrepresented, they can take the price off, for the commission that would be paid. But it looks like with our new residential listing agreements, we're always going to be checking that additional compensation if the buyer's unrepresented. So the buyers need to understand that the sellers, if you're represented or not, the seller is going to be paying extra for your offer.
Why do they need to know that?
Well, because they think they're, being unrepresented, they think they're going to get a better deal, but they're really not, because the seller really is paying, because we have that box marked saying we're going to agree to pay extra compensation if it's unrepresented. The buyer thinks no one's getting paid, but you are in fact getting paid another 1.5 or whatever.
Yeah,
You understand where I'm going?
Well, I mean, I don't think that if I don't represent a buyer as a fiduciary, I don't think they're entitled to know what my compensation is.
Agreed, but they need to understand that most sellers and their agent have a contract that if there's an unrepresented buyer, the seller will be paying more compensation to that agent because of the extra work. So, I mean, somehow buyers need to understand that it's not always advantageous to not be represented.
Yeah, it'd be a reason not to go to the listing agent, because there's not that big of a difference between their broker that you're going to ask them to sign and the listing agreement that we're assuming has been negotiated. Like, it's not like that fee doesn't exist at all.
Well, my fear, my fear is that a buyer is going to go do their searching. They're going to call the listing agent. The listing agent's going to show them. The listing agent's going to give them the information, and then they're going to go hire a transactional broker to represent them for $1,000. Say, would you, write all this paperwork for me and take me through this transaction for $1,000? And so then when the offer comes in from this transactional broker that's earning $1,000, they're only doing paperwork, and I, as a listing broker, am still opening up for inspections, and I'm providing this and I'm doing that, and I'm doing all kinds of stuff that a full service buyer broker would be doing. That's why I said I don't want to go less than 3%. In fact, I'm thinking maybe 3.5 or 4% is even more appropriate. I can always negotiate it down if there's a full service broker on the other side, if that makes sense. But I'm more concerned about a buyer getting a discount representative because they only want to pay $1,000 and they're willing to waste my time. I don't want to waste my time. I want to be paid for my time. And if I'm not representing them, I'm representing the seller. And so it's to the seller's benefit to pay me. Go ahead, Dana.
So as you said a little earlier, there are going to be many, many scenarios, and most of them are few and far between, off the wall things that we're gonna have to deal with, as we always have had to. So why not just put 3 and 3? And if you explain to your seller that, what the standard compensation has been is 6%. So let's just put this 3 and 3. And I'm trying to interpretate the unrepresented buyer. So they come in as an unrepresented buyer. So we, as the listing agent, will say, would you like for me to represent you, since you don't have an agent? And here's why, because this is everything I'm going to do for you. So then you've already got the seller set up to pay 3% on that side. If that doesn't happen, then you know that it's up to 3%. So if a buyer comes in and asks for 2 or whatever, or $1,000, then the seller is going to benefit because they're not going to have to pay the whole 3%. if it's truly unrepresented. But the idea is you're gonna try to get them to, you're gonna ask them if they would like for me as the listing agent to represent them. So that's the first go-to. And just let's go with that positive thought. And if you have some off the wall buyer that's gonna be trying to do all crazy things and save money, then you deal with that. But let's deal with what is more likely to happen. And that is they're gonna say, well, yeah, I don't have an agent. Yeah, do you want to represent me? Sure.
But what happens next is you're going to ask your seller to pay you to be their fiduciary, right? So that conversation, I imagine, going a little differently, and the seller is going to say, wait, I thought I'm paying you to be my fiduciary, to be my agent. Now I'm paying you to be theirs. If you're going to be theirs, A, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that, and B, why am I paying? You know, that's how I see that going. I don't know.
Well, we are asking them, basically, the bottom line is we're all hoping that the seller is just going to pay both sides,
Sure, but if it's two separate
one
agents,
way or
that'd be
another.
different.
So it's the conversation that you have initially with your seller.
Real quick, Mark, for paperwork purposes, we'll have two separate compensation contracts when there's an offer, more than likely, or whatever. If the compensation is different than what is on our contract, if it ends up being different, do we need to provide a modification of terms?
Yes.
Because, yes, so anytime it's different, we need to add that modification of terms to match what's really being paid, correct?
Yes. Yeah, so one of the forms, and we didn't go over it today, but there's a new form in Win Forms that's a modification of terms for a buyer broker. And, you know, there's not a bucket in SkySlope for it, because you're not going to be submitting your buyer broker agreement into SkySlope until you have a contract. And so if in the negotiation, let's say you start out with 3% on your buyer broker agreement and it gets negotiated to 2.5%, you're going to have to modify that buyer broker agreement in order to make it valid. And then you're going to upload, both documents into the same bucket at the same time, which is a buyer's representation agreement. And one little thing for all of you is don't send, if you're a listing agent and you get an offer, and you get an offer from somebody that's asking for 3% and you only want to pay them 2.5%, don't send a modification to the buyer broker agreement to them, to the other agent, because you're not a party to that contract. So modify the seller to pay the buyer broker down to the 2% or 2.5%, but don't try to modify the buyer broker agreement because you're not a party to it. That's a mistake we've already seen happen once.
Okay, to be continued, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It will be continued.
Based on all this, write your questions down, and I'm sure Friday we can open it for discussion again.
Yeah.
I have
Thank you,
one more
Mark.
thing.
You're awesome.
Thank you, Mark.